I call to order the multi-stakeholder hearing in preparation for the high-level meeting of the General Assembly to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the First World Conference on Women. I would like to extend a warm welcome to you all. This meeting is held in accordance with General Assembly Resolution 73/340 entitled Scope, Modalities, Format, and Organization of the High-Level Meeting on the 25th anniversary of the First World Conference on Women. Before proceeding further, I would like to make some procedural remarks. I would like to inform the participants that the remote simultaneous interpretation of the proceedings is provided by the United Nations for the purpose of facilitating communication. Participants are requested to be mindful of the additional difficulties experienced by interpreters when working in remote mode and of the increased likelihood of disruptions to the audio feed to the interpreters. Participants may select the preferred language to hear the interpretation or choose the none option to hear the original language. If you face audio or visual issues during this meeting, please use the Restart All Lines button above the hand icon. Should the problem persist, reload your browser. Honorable Ministers, Executive Director, UN Women, Excellencies, distinguished panelists, participants, viewers around the world. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the multi-stakeholder hearing in preparation for the high-level meeting on the 25th anniversary of the First Conference on Women, which will take place in the fall. I thank you all for taking the time to join this discussion, which offers each of us an opportunity to listen to and learn from voices of change. This is crucial in our efforts to accelerate the realization of gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. After its adoption 25 years ago, the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action remains the most comprehensive and transformative global agenda for the achievement of gender equality. We have made some progress. There are more girls in school than ever before, and between the years 2000 and 2017, the global maternity rate declined by 38%. However, in efforts to prevent the spread of COVID-19, schools have closed and essential resources for women's health have been redirected toward the pandemic response. Moreover, women have been disproportionately burdened by a significant uptick in unpaid care work, and the rates of gender-based violence have risen in an alarming rate. We simply cannot allow the coronavirus to threaten the lives and future of women. The needs of women and girls must be central to both rapid response and long-term recovery planning. Indeed, women should be included in every decision-making forum. Gender equality is everybody's responsibility. We need to amplify the voice of every girl and facilitate women's leadership in all arenas. Indeed, we cannot implement the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development as a whole if we do not achieve gender equality. As we begin the decade of action and deliberate to implement the SDGs, we must recommit to the targets of SDG 5 to build a more equal, just, peaceful, and sustainable world for all. Sisters and brothers, I trust that you will interact with the panelists throughout the day utilizing the chat box. However, the conversation must move beyond this virtual platform. We need to engage as many people as possible in this discussion if we are to create tangible, lasting change for women and girls around the world. I encourage each of you to text your families, your friends, and your professional network and invite them to tune into the event coverage on UN Web TV. They can also join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag Generation Equality. In the words of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, gender is not an easy conversation to have because thinking of changing the status quo is always uncomfortable. Well, today is a day for that uncomfortable conversation, which will guide us in our quest to build a better world for everyone, everywhere. It's thus my pleasure to leave the floor to the first moderator of the day, Ms. Nedzi E. Gumbazonva, Chief Executive Officer of the Rosaria Memorial Trust. I thank you. As indicated in my letters dated 10 and 17 July 2020, the Gender Equality Leaders Dialogue, moderated by Reza Gumbon Vanda, Chief Executive of the Zaria Memorial Trust, will take place immediately after this opening statement. After that, the first interactive panel discussion entitled Women's and Girls' Voices, Participation and Leadership, moderated by Ms. Chidi King, Director of the Equality Department of the International Trade Union Confederation, will take place from 11:45 a.m. to 12:50 p.m. The second interactive panel discussion entitled Achieving Gender Equality is Everyone's Responsibility, moderated by Mr. Eddie Ndopu, United Nations Secretary General's Global Advocates for the Sustainable Development Goals and Humanity and Inclusion Goal Ambassador, will take place from 11:55 p.m. to 2 p.m. After a break from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m., the third interactive panel discussion entitled Gender Equality and Women's and Girls' Empowerment, Drivers for Sustainable Development, moderated by Ms. Magdalena Superbelda Camona, Executive Director, Global Initiative for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, will take place from 3 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. Then a segment entitled A Conversation About the Future, moderated by Ms. Promdili Molombo Nguka, Executive Director of UN Women, will take place from 4:30 p.m. to 4:45 p.m. The closing segment will take place immediately after that segment. I would like now to invite the moderator and panelists to commence the Gender Equality Leaders Dialogue. The opening segment is now concluded. Ms. Gwenda, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Your Excellency, the President of the UN, the President of the UN General Assembly, Your Excellency, Mr. Tijan Mohamed Bande. Thank you so much for that extraordinary welcome and opening statement. I welcome you all to the Gender Equality Leaders Dialogue for this multi-stakeholder hearing on Beijing Plus 25. I would like to start, before we proceed any further, I would like to make some procedural announcements. Panelists will not be able to unmute. Panelists will not be able to unmute their microphones or engage in their video unless given the floor by the moderator. When called upon to speak, the panelists will receive a message saying that their streaming is approved. Please press the video button appearing in the message in order to share your video and audio. I'll do my best to announce 2 to 3 upcoming speakers at a time. If you face audio or video issues during the meeting, please use the restart all lines button above the hand icon. Should the problem persist, reload your browser. In order to enable everyone to contribute to this dialogue in the best possible manner and to finish on time, I seek the cooperation of all of you. I kindly request panelists to keep your replies short, not to exceed 3 minutes for the opening question. Subsequent responses and comments will be limited to 1 or 2 minutes. I apologize in advance if I have to interrupt the speakers. I don't intend to, and I hope that it will not come to that with your cooperation. I should also like to remind that we have posted short biographical information about each speaker on the website, and with all the protocol duly and respectfully observed, I'll use my panelist titles only. Again, Mr. President, Your Excellency, Mr. Mohamed Bande, UN Women Executive Director, Dr. Pumsile Mlambo-Ngcuka, honorable ministers, friends, colleagues, it's really an honor for me to be invited to moderate this session. I am sitting in my village in Zimbabwe, and we know that we are all requested and expected to wear our masks because we are in a world of COVID-19, which COVID-19 prevented us to meet in person for the UNCSW meeting, our annual gathering. COVID-19, we understand that the most vulnerable are those who have preconditions, existing preconditions. Gender inequality is the greatest, the longest, the deepest systematic precondition that exists in society. And therefore, we are focusing today on the commitments that were made in Beijing, but also knowing that we have to address the underlying issues that we have to respond to. We know that we have a political declaration, and as I invite you to the multi-stakeholder hearing, and especially for this segment, we are building deeply on the commitments to action, but also the implementation. We are and have always talked about responding issues based on intersectionality, intergenerationality, which is important, but also context. I know that I'm a panelist, and I know that I'm a moderator, and I have deep passion on the issues that are before us. But colleagues and friends around the world, it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists. We'll start with the range of panelists, the ministerial panel, and then go to the other stakeholders and civil society, and who will lead us in the deep conversations around the issues that are critical to us. I would like to invite the first three speakers in order would be Her Excellency Zaruhi Batoyan, Minister of Labor and Social Affairs in Armenia, would be followed by His Excellency Mr. David Moinina Senge, Minister of Primary and Secondary Education of Sierra Leone, and then His Excellency Frankie Campbell, Minister of Social Services and Urban Development of the Bahamas. And then we proceed to the other speakers. May I give the floor to Her Excellency Zaruhi Batoyan, Minister of Labor and Social Affairs of Armenia. And Honorable Minister, to open our conversation, can you share with us some of the good practices in your country, in your experience, that are ensuring that women and girls who experience these multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, vulnerability, and marginalization throughout their life course can fully benefit from policy intervention? Some examples. Over to you, Honorable Minister.
Thank you, distinguished President of the General Assembly, dear participants, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for this opportunity. It was with a great pleasure for me to accept the invitation to speak in this important event. As the distinguished participants might be aware, Armenia is currently chairing the UN Commission on the Status of Women, and on 1st July became global leader to technology and innovation for gender equality action coalition of UN-led Generation Equality Forum. Thus, once again, reaffirming its commitment to support the global efforts for gender equality. Good practices emerge from the solutions we give to different problems, which vary depending on individual and environmental factors. For example, being a person with disability helps me to overcome different work-related difficulties because the routine of inconvenience caused by disability makes a person be creative. That experience can differ from individual to individual, and talking about it with each other broadens our horizons and enrich policies. The recording precondition for making our policies accessible to women and girls who repeatedly experience multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination is ensuring their participation at all stages. The distinguished coordinator in her question referred to multiple and intersecting forms of vulnerability and marginalization that women experience nowadays. In this context, I would like to note that these days Armenia, like other countries in the world, is fighting against the COVID-19 pandemic. The participation of female medical workers, their experience-based recommendations are available in the general struggle context. Unfortunately, in recent days, another issue is on the agenda of Armenian citizens, which is the violation of ceasefire regime by Azerbaijan on the Armenian-Azerbaijani border. On the factories situated in border region of Armenia, which produced thousands of masks a day, was bombarded a few days ago. In this difficult situation, the voices of women must be heard not only inside Armenia, but also in the international arena. In this regard, I urge my female colleagues to pay special attention to women's participation at all levels of conflict, prevention, management, and resolution. We believe that participation is one of the guarantees of solidarity in all spheres of life, and the voices of women exposed to systematic discrimination must be decisive. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. I'll come back to you, and you have really shown the intel and reflected in the very experience that you have in Armenia and Azerbaijan and the border issues around 1325 and the linkage with Beijing, the Beijing Platform for Action. Let me quickly move to Sierra Leone and invite our Honorable Minister from Sierra Leone to speak to us. Can you share with us? We really are concerned and have always been around gender-based violence in school.
Thank you very much.
David Moinina.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, Your Excellency Presidents, other honorable ministers and other excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for this high-level multi-stakeholder conversation. I think when we speak about gender violence, particularly in schools, it is easy perhaps to think immediately to physical violence. But we know that particularly for girls, there's a lot of violence, emotional and psychosocial violence. And our objectives in Sierra Leone, one of the things that we worked on is to ensure that the school is the safest place. It's the safest place for every child, and in particularly for girls. Now, during Ebola, we know that about 10,000 people we know that about 10,000 people actually got pregnant, 10,000 girls got pregnant and were prevented from going to school. And that then led to them dropping out, amongst other things. So one of the things that we did by cabinet led by the president was about a week before or 2 weeks before COVID, we closed down schools. We removed the ban that prevented pregnant girls from going to school as a cabinet decision that we overturned from the government prior. And we set up a task force on sexual and reproductive health that was quite consultative and broad stroke. And I brought to cabinet allowed us as well to set up 2 policies. One was on radical inclusion. And the radical inclusion policy says really that it doesn't matter who you are, particularly if you're a girl or somebody with a disability, whether you're in the rural or urban, whether you're connected or unconnected, whether you're on the grid or not, we will ensure that you have the same access to quality education. So we had a radical inclusion policy that is being developed and a comprehensive safety policy. And I mentioned that this comprehensive safety policy really is about ensuring that from the minute you wear a uniform or just by being a student and a recognized pupil, you're protected and you're secure, and that the entire stakeholders are there to protect you. And when schools closed for COVID, we went on a zero pregnancy campaign where we engaged communities and as we gave dry ration as part of school feeding, we engaged communities so that they can make commitments actually for for protecting girls. We launched our radio teaching program, and we this time brought on sexual reproductive health radio into the curriculum. So our radio teaching program has included sexual and reproductive health and conversation with young girls. And we see that our partners, Act One, Purposeful, and a couple of the other partners that we have developed special radio programs that are going on education radio, special drama that are about girls and for including girls. So we understand that the way we protect girls and that the way we ensure that they're secure and safe is not just in theory or on policy. It requires that we address this issue because it's both a health issue, it's also an education issue, it's a community issue, and certainly it's a policy issue. And one of the things that we just passed last week is what we're calling a Stay in School incentive program, such that post-COVID, when girls come to school, but when girls come back to school, we will incentivize and put out systems in place for them that will ensure that they're protected as well. Something what we are doing, but it really is a consultative process.
Thank you so much, Honorable Minister. And we are concerned, and at some moment would like to hear a little bit about the case of the little girl, the issues, there were issues in the media around violence. So just a feedback on that. I would like to invite the Honorable Minister from the Bahamas. If you can take the floor, Minister of Social Services, Mr. Frankie Campbell, and then you'll be followed immediately with the Honorable Minister from Korea and then Argentina. Over to you, Honorable Minister.
Madam Moderator, Excellencies, there is a distinct interlink between.
My question to you is, what are those integrated strategies? You know, we need integrated strategies to achieve some big collective results. When we look at those interventions which are connected, can you share with us from your experience in the Bahamas?
Madam Moderator, Excellencies, thank you. There is a distinct interlinkage between the advancement and the empowerment of women and girls and the resilience of their country. The lived reality of the extensive negative impact of climate change on small island developing states, such as the Bahamas, must be acknowledged. Hurricane Dorian caused unprecedented catastrophic destruction with damages estimated at $3.4 billion. This is our reality. The Bahamas is not alone in its experience with climate crisis, which exacerbates the vulnerabilities of SIDS. Just in April of this year, our sister countries of the Solomon Islands, the Vanuatu, Fiji, and Tonga were devastated by Cyclone Harold. The negative direct and indirect effects of climate change threaten the full and effective enjoyment of a range of human rights, including the right to life, education, food, health, water, and sanitation. Climate change impacts our people, impacts our land, and our survival. SIDS are among the most vulnerable to the devastating effects of climate change, and our countries are now also grappling with the shocks of the COVID-19 pandemic. These circumstances can diminish the country's ability to function, to advance the cause of women. We must, particularly our family island women, women with disabilities, migrant women, and older women, we must acknowledge that funding is critical to SIDS. We must also acknowledge that partnerships and technical training are necessary for recovery. Mechanisms such as the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, the Samoa Pathway Partnership, and the 2030 Agenda represents opportunities to address a range of interlinked challenges identified by the UN, such as food security, sustainability, and disaster risk reduction. The Bahamas is grateful for the assistance received from the regional and international community, particularly after Hurricane Dorian. Such partnerships are crucial to the ongoing recovery efforts. The Bahamas remains committed to the implementation of the Beijing Platform for Action. The Bahamas has continued its efforts in mainstreaming a gender perspective into climate change and sustainability policies by forming an intergovernmental panel on climate change, inclusive of implementing legislation to ban single-use plastics. We've provided a budget allocation of $16 million for a national food task force, ensuring that houses, particularly led by females, have food. We've created an SDG unit, and we are also nurturing the relationships with our NGOs to assist with the monitoring and responding to these challenges that women and girls are affected by. And finally, we've funded the Bahamian chapter of the Caribbean Women in Leadership to ensure that more of our women and girls are prepared to sit at the table and participate in the leadership-making decisions. The Bahamas recognizes the disproportionate effect of climate change and natural disasters that impact women and girls. We remain committed to tackling interlinked challenges in an integrated manner, especially through partnerships. Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Honorable Minister, for reminding us of the climate change and the gender justice issues within the climate change discussion, even when we are facing a range of other issues. I want to come back to you later around the budget. You shared an allocation, so we want to know how that is translating into the numbers, into the enjoyment of human rights. But again, congratulations for the great work that you are doing. I'd like to invite the Honorable Minister of Korea, Her Excellency Jung Ok-lee, Minister of Gender, Equality and Family of the Republic of Korea. Honorable Minister, institutions, our institutions, how can they ensure that gender equality and women's empowerment is at the core of the response packages of COVID-19, and that we are not just a statistic of risk, vulnerability, gender-based violence, but actually is at the core of the response? Over to you, Honorable Minister.
Yeah, here is a deep midnight. It is a great pleasure to meet all of you. Lee Jung-ok, Minister of Gender Equality and Family of the Republic of Korea. I think it is a great privilege to join this forum that will discuss the current status and future directions of gender equality amid COVID-19 on this specific occasion of the 25th anniversary of the Fourth World Conference on Women. Korea is strictly implementing quarantine measures while working to achieve economic stability. We responded to COVID-19 effectively with a swift and large-scale infectious disease control system named 3Ts: testing, tracing, and treatment. Also, the Korean people, the true hero and heroine, has actively complied with the government quarantine measures such as wearing masks and the social distancing. Meanwhile, to overcome economic crisis, the government offered the emergency disaster relief funds to all Korean households and emergency employment stabilization support funds for vulnerable workers who are not eligible for employment insurances. Going forward, the government will create jobs through Korean New Deal based on Green New Deal and Digital New Deal while strengthening the employment safety net. As a result of these efforts, Korea was able to overcome the rapid spread of COVID-19. Also, our endeavor to contain virus without closing borders has been widely praised by the international community. In Korea's handling of the COVID-19 crisis, we have witnessed the remarkable women's leadership and role in all sectors. Women leaders have provided information transparently and managed the crisis in a calm and stable manner with the people's trust. In addition, many frontline female workers and caretakers are dedicating themselves in the fight against the invisible enemy, braving the risk of being exposed to the virus. To overcome the COVID-19 crisis, we need to guarantee women's participation in the policymaking process so that their experiences and the specific needs can be reflected. The Ministry of Gender Equality and Family is making diverse efforts to ensure gender equality in COVID-19 response. First, the ministry is holding relay forums and conducting gender impact analysis on COVID-19 policies. In addition, the ministry participates in the Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasure Headquarters with the gender lens to contribute to introducing necessary measures for the marginalized people, including women. For instance, as the disaster relief funds have been provided based on the family unit, the government allowed any member of a household to apply for the funds so that the victims of domestic violence can benefit even if they live apart from the head of a household. To relieve each household's care burden, the ministry has expanded the public child care program and visiting education service for multicultural family children to help their online class. Use after-school academies offer the academic support and meals. Last but not least, the ministry will host the 2020 Korea Gender Equality Forum on September 3rd and 4th to discuss gender equality and the COVID-19 crisis. I would like to take this opportunity to ask for your interest and participation. This badge is the symbol of the thank you for all the caretakers. Thank you for this precious opportunity.
Thank you so much, Minister. And I have a follow-up question with you, Honorable Minister Jungak. I've been to your country, and it's one of the countries that also have women leadership. Can you how can we make sure that women are in the decision-making around COVID-19, whether it's in the science, among the scientists or the frontline work? What are the policies you are putting in place to make sure women are actually participating in the actual decision-making, in addition to your ministry's leadership that you have shared with us? At the state level, at the community level, just to hear the feel of how your strategies for women's involvement. And then I'll immediately come to the Bahamas for us to continue that conversation a little bit on budget. Honorable Minister Jungok.
Because our government has pushed the public women's public representation further. We have a certain quota system, so all the central government and the public institutions should have a women leadership at least 20%. So we have achieved this goal, and all those kind of professional areas, including health sector, are presided by women leaders, and they can fulfill their professional leadership and also women's caretaking leadership. So in that sense, in this COVID-19 situation, those kind of affirmative action on public women's representation made a very effective impact in dealing with this situation very effectively. So we proved the women's leadership can manage and deal with this kind of contingent situations. So the ordinary people's trust, especially those who working in the health sector, they get the huge public trust in persuading ordinary situation, and also those kind of professional data sharing. So so it is a kind of a big step forward to make a women leadership, not only biologically but also professionally.
Thank you so much. It's about intentionality. It's about putting measures like quota system. It's about data. and sharing practice. Thank you so much, Honorable Minister. I want to move immediately back to my Honorable Minister from the Bahamas. Very, very important discussions around climate change and around gender budgeting. So if you can share with us a little bit, in just a few moments, how the issue of gender budgeting is also around partnerships and alliances, but a little bit on that, on the issues around resource allocation and the essence of partnerships and alliances for us to achieve gender equality. Over to you, Honorable Minister. And then I'll immediately come back to Sierra Leone, to my minister from Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We recognize that in times of crisis, women and girls are most vulnerable. We are aware that statistics show that women head a number of households. And so as we approach the response to the COVID pandemic, mindful that unemployment would have increased significantly, we wanted to ensure that one of our basic needs are met. And so in addition to an already increased budget of $10 million for social assistance, the Bahamas government committed to a $16 million National Food Distribution Task Force. This task force, I'm pleased to say, is headed by a woman. And this task force is headed by an independent body. So it's void of political partisanship. It is divided because you would be aware that the Bahamas is an archipelago. So it is divided into 9 regions, and they went ahead and they co-opted persons who were already in the feeding business. So they didn't have to reinvent the wheel. And it is ensuring that throughout the Bahamas, that all persons are having opportunity. And so we have the involvement of civil society, NGOs, non-profit organizations that make up this entity. And thus far, we're satisfied that it has been working and it is being monitored for increase where necessary.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Minister, for sharing those clear examples. I would like to go back to my Honorable Minister from Sierra Leone and to continue to build that conversation on education. But before we go there, Minister, we have seen you carrying your baby at the back, and your and the photo went viral. It's part of education. It's reconceptualizing care work. It's redefining masculinity. It's positioning the conversation out there around how we socialize leadership. So, Honorable Minister, what is the role of, what you see, if you can just, you talked about gender-based violence, but more so, how do you see as the role of education much more significantly in transforming gender stereotypes, re-victimization of women, and all the underlying issues? Over to you, Minister.
Thank you very much. You know, we just launched our curriculum framework, which it was the first time we've done it in decades. And I'm focusing on, for basic education, what we call the 5 C's: critical thinking, comprehension, creativity, civics, and I forget what the other C is, comprehension. But I think in the civics framework, right, and all of this, when in the framework, we're talking about sexual and reproductive health, we're talking about gender, we're talking about inclusive education, all of this are embedded within the framework. Those are things that we care about. The idea around embedding these morals, these values.
Have we lost our minister? It seems we have lost our Honorable Minister. Connection issue.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, Honorable Minister, you may continue.
Yeah, thank you.
We lost you for some moments.
Yeah, I'm not sure where you lost me, but I do want to say that actually, I do agree with you that this is about changing our mindsets, our culture, our education through very practical ways. You know, the Ministry of Gender and Children's Affairs is currently working on the Child Rights Act from 2007. We're updating it now, and that's currently being reviewed, and we're changing a whole bunch of different things, including the early marriage, which used to be that I think if you were 16, but your parents consulted and your parents approved, then you can do it. Now we're making it to only 18 and over. So changing early marriage. One thing that you mentioned with the photo, which is linked to this, is around the male strategy and the male engagement strategy. And this is something that the Minister of Gender and Children talks about a lot. And she has an element in which, so I am championing this as well through UN Women and the Ministry of Gender. And this matters because sexual and gender violence often requires two different genders, and where most of the time it is that males are the ones who are having physical violence and sexual violence and gender-based violence. We do need to have role models in society. And those role models do not just come from us writing policies and sipping it down their throats. They need to understand, young people, young boys, need to understand what the role of the stakeholders in the home are. That the home is about the service and what you do and how you raise family. That you respecting your wife and you respecting your role as a father, you being able to take care of your family. If you extend that to your family and you raise your hand up to change a diaper. Like, I know many of my friends who've never changed a diaper in their life. It's not like men and women get born and they put a gene for diaper changing. In women, there's no diaper changing gene. But we do have many men in society who put their hands up to say, I've never changed a diaper. And I think it is that we need to have in society role models, and particularly, and I think that photo perhaps went viral because we don't see our leaders doing it. We don't see our particularly male leaders. It's almost a taboo to be a leader, a minister or a president or somebody, and you get seen providing care because that's what your wife or the women should be doing. And what's interesting for me is and I said to a couple of people, that photo went viral, perhaps because it was me, but my wife does it all the time, and I do it all the time when I'm with the kids. It wasn't the first time I carried my kid on my back. It won't be the last time. It certainly has happened many, many times before. But the idea
Thank you,
of...
Minister.
Sorry, go ahead.
I know this is a critical reflection around shifting gender norms. But we have to move, and we may come back to you. But again, we just want to say thank you so much. I want to invite the Honorable Minister from Armenia. You were the first to share with us, and can you just reflect on what is partnership and alliances meant for you? And how can we replicate some of the ways in which you've worked in partnership? What were those kind of partnerships for you to deliver on the gender equality commitment? And for all those who are following us, continue to tweet, continue to follow us on social media. We are on web TV as well. And definitely we have the ministers who are sharing with us their experiences, but giving direction for the future. Honorable Minister from Armenia.
Thank you. Dialogue has a vital importance for eliminating all forms of discrimination against women. And that cooperation must be sensitive to the problems of women of all groups equally, regardless of their other personal or non-personal characteristics. Dialogue should aim to solve issues through the possibly broadest level of agreement. And indeed, the best option is reaching consensus. Cooperation towards achieving gender equality can often be hampered because, as in all political processes here as well, there are other interests. The Armenian government is determined to achieve gender equality. That determination is based on political dialogue. If the mutual trust between the stakeholders is strong, neither the government nor the civil society will back down. In 2018, a Velvet Revolution took place in Armenia, and that change came about through the decentralized cooperation of the citizens. Each citizen was choosing for himself or herself the form of the struggle, but it had to comply with the principle of democracy and the condition of non-violence. A few days ago, the national security strategy of Armenia was adopted, which incidentally was developed with the direct participation of female representatives. We stipulated in the strategy that the concept of society free from violence is an important prerequisite for public solidarity, and we are determined to pursue a culture of non-violence. This is our vision of cooperation between different parties to achieve gender equality. I hope that our experience of cooperation in this issue will become exemplary for many societies and strengthen global cooperation for the sake of all women and girls. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Honorable Minister. And just want to give a big applause to all my ministers as we move to the next section of our conversations. We may come back to you again, time allowing. I would like to also inform that we have received apologies from the Honorable Minister of Women and Gender and Diversity of Argentina. The minister may be able to join us later, but we were having problems of connecting. And also to recognize Lina Abu Habib from Lebanon, who also due to connectivity has not been able to join us. So we continue the conversations, and we are really engaged in this multi-stakeholder hearing and conversation on Beijing Plus 25. I'd like to invite Nino Longjaria, who is the ombudsperson of Georgia, to talk to us. And can you share with us what are the examples of good practices for ensuring that women and girls who experience multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and vulnerability can fully benefit from policy intervention? Over to you, Nino. Whilst we wait for the connection with our sister, who is the public defender of the Ombuds of Georgia, I would like to invite Alison Tuman, who is the Global Program Leader for Procter & Gamble, and to be followed by Abel Coker from Tanzania. So, Alison, can you share with us around private sector engagement in achieving the Beijing Plus 25 agenda and reflect as somebody who is a leader within the private sector? Alison, over to you.
Thank you, Madame, and Your Excellencies. It's an honor on behalf of Procter & Gamble to join the United Nations and the international community today, and I do thank you for the opportunity to bring the private sector perspective to these important conversations taking place in this virtual hearing. The private sector can contribute to the vital efforts to accelerate the implementation progress on the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. And We know that when equality improves, communities are healthier, businesses like ours and many others can thrive, and the world is truly a better place for everyone. Equality benefits all of us, and it will take all of us, the private sector, the public sector, the non-governmental organizations, and civil society here with us today, all of us working together to make the progress we need. And together we can have a greater impact because we each bring unique lived experiences, skills, and perspectives as both individuals and through our organizations. Many companies around the globe do share this clear and mutual aspiration with other sectors of society, including the public sector, who's represented so well by all the honorable ministers so far. We do know that to build this better world for all of us, one that's free from gender bias, and we see equal voice, equal opportunity, and equal representation for all individuals, a world where everyone sees equal, it will take alliances and partnerships. They've been vital and crucial to the progress we've made so far and for what we need to do in the future. The private sector, we believe, can lead in tackling gender bias and promoting women's leadership. And we can help to deeply change those biases that have been ingrained over many, many centuries, really, because they are often, those deeply held biases, what reinforce many of the greatest barriers to women's progress. And we can use our core business operations and functions, our supply chains, distribution networks, and especially our advertising, our media and communications work to promote gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. We know that these communications shape how people see the world, and it does have the power to spark conversations that can change mindsets about women and girls, but also for men and boys, as so eloquently stated just moments ago by the Honorable Minister from Sierra Leone with his very personal example. This begins with something as simple as how we accurately portray people, all people in their humanity, and in our advertising and communications. We have to be very deliberate about it, and we need to measure it, just like all the other outcomes that we're searching for and want to see achieved in the world. And we've also called, from our perspective on P&G, to work together with our peer companies in the global industry to get to this 100% accurate portrayal of women and girls. And we also need to be very intentional about showing men as equal partners in our families doing the unpaid care work, like changing diapers and nappies, as we just heard, or cleaning floors, washing up, and doing laundry. Our voices in business can tackle specific issues, including nearly all of the 12 areas of concern of the Beijing Platform for Action that remain. And we and many other companies have done so and are continuing to do so through campaigns like Share the Load, about domestic work, Like a Girl, about the view of the girl child, and Change Destiny, about the expectations of women's roles in society. There are many, many more that are illuminating and addressing other issues like pay equality, gender-based violence, education and STEM, health, women's leadership. I could go on and name all 12. But another way that we can support in the private sector is also setting a higher standard for our own companies and the companies we do business with. It must continue to be a common agenda, not a competitive one, as collectively we need to intensify our efforts as shared in the latest political statement, because we know that there are still consistent and quite alarming estimates on the number of years it's going to take us to close the gap. So we do have a lot of work to do. And on behalf of the private sector, we look forward to the dialogue to come today and our efforts to come in the future. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alison. Remain there. Let's reflect a little bit on some points. When I'm sitting here in Zimbabwe with the women frontline responders to COVID-19, we are making liquid soap, sanitizers, and the fear is big business will come and take away our innovation. And women in communities are enterprising, they are entrepreneurial, they are resourcing with minimum or with nothing. How do you see that gap of big business and women's business in communities being the part of the new norm?
I think you have an excellent point. Women are often those who find the solutions in their communities through resourceful and ingenious solutions to challenges that they face for their families, their communities, and beyond. And I think there is the opportunity to find those solutions support those women entrepreneurs, because we know that if we can invest back through our supply chains or through our economic efforts, that those women will change the communities that they live in. They will lift up entire societies and communities. And certainly the UN has multiple reports of data about that impact. So the challenge for business is to listen and learn from these women in these communities, to find the ways that these solutions can be scaled to other places, but certainly to ensure that these women are included in these global and even local supply chains, to ensure that the economic empowerment is contributed back to them and their communities. And there's many collaborations around the world, alliances to do just this. But we do recognize that the statistics show that the women's empowerment and the barriers they face in their economic entrepreneurial efforts must be addressed. And we need policy interventions to do that. We need businesses to understand what that looks like going forward in a collaborative and with a gender lens on the work we do in our supply chains. And so, we take that challenge, and that's something that we have done for more than 40 years around the world in our own supply chain here. And we look to grow and expand that as much as we can internationally, because over the next decade, women entrepreneurs will find the solutions to some of our biggest problems.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those reflections. I also serve in the external advisory group to the IMF Managing Director, Ms. Georgiana. And one of the things that really we worried around is when we talk big money, the trillions, the billions, the SDRs, we talk big companies, big business, and then there's very silent conversation around investing for community. So I really am just so grateful for the reflections that you've had with us around the supply chain and the connectivity. We'll come back to you. And again, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Alison. I would like to invite Abel Koaka. Abel, you are a project leader with Tutimize Ahadi project at Restless Development in Tanzania. Asante sana. And we are very much to see that you are really committed to haki za wakina mama and na vijana, rights of women, and my little Kiswahili comes back immediately. Can you share with us, Abel Koaka, how can institutions really, you being part of the Restless Development, how do you see these institutions responding to having gender equality as part of the core package around COVID-19? What is happening in Tanzania? Share with us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Madam Moderator. Your Excellencies, all protocols is observed, and greetings wherever you are in the world. Amidst the outbreak of COVID-19, we see an increase in gender-based violence, unpaid care work, and disruption in access to sexual reproductive services, but also economic hardship among women and girls. And this is pulling us back from the realization of the Beijing Platform for Action. But instead of the pandemic forcing us to step back, we must see it as an opportunity to come together, strategize, and work out with a concrete plan on truly inclusive and gender equitable recovery plan with women and girls at the front and the center. As you mentioned, Madam Moderator, I'm working with young people from across civil society, public and private sector, and in research, among others. And what young people are demanding from the institution are the following. Young people are demanding for the availability of gender statistics to enable stakeholders to measure the impact of the pandemic and design inclusive programs, but also to ensure there is inclusive financial relief infrastructures and economic stimulus package to support women businesses. But also, young people are demanding for an increase in training and accessibility to young women on online business tools, and access to training and education, which will help them to access different economic opportunity. Also, young people are calling upon governments to categorize access to both sexual reproductive health and rights services and gender-based violence services as an essential. And this means investing in those services by making sure that the availability and accessibility is not in anyhow disrupted during and post-COVID. But also in ensuring that women are involved in decision-making in response to the pandemic, we need to institutionalize young women leadership to enable them to have a seat at the table, such as parliament, health ministries, and in governance in the post-pandemic world. And this will give them access to prioritize, mainstream, and incorporate gender as a key planning component in budget allocation so that girls and women can have access to different intervention they need in the design and implementation of COVID response. Through our youth-led accountability mode at Restless Development, we have been able to build young people's capacity to be at the heart of accountability action. We have supported young people to generate and use data to demand for the realization of gender equality, but also access to sexual reproductive health and services before, during, and we are going to do this in the post-pandemic. And through the Beijing Plus 25 Youth Task Force under UN Women, we believe that young people have the power, voice, and potential to bring positive changes in the community. But that power, voice, and potential must be unleashed and amplified. It is time for governments, intergovernmental organizations, civil societies, NGOs, and others to invest in the program which will unleash young people's power, but also to move resources directly to youth-led groups, organizations, and initiatives. It is high time we make young people key stakeholders in decisions that directly impact their lives and not merely beneficiaries. We must replicate youth-led accountability model and innovation in governance so that we center the voice of young people, girls and women in decision-making processes. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you so much, Wanako. Remain there, let's talk. Usually, when we talk about youth and youth-led, I told you I'm living in my village. At times, there is this youth who are the elite, the ones in town. How do you see bridging the inequalities among young people? That we have young people in the villages who may not even have access to technology like now, young girls who are married, who are out of school. Can you talk to us about the inequalities and some of the challenges that exist among the demographic of young people? How we can bridge those, because that is also what is share with us.
Yeah, you are very right. Some of the ways we can bridge that is to make sure that we have equitable laws which are safeguarding and protecting the interest of young people. Talking about young girls who are married at the teenage ages, we have laws in different parts of the world or countries which are open the Pandora box for young girls to enter into marriage at the teenage ages. And in Tanzania, for example, we had that law and it was challenged in the court, and the court declared it as unconstitutional. But another thing is to make sure that we have program which we will unleash the potential of young people. It's not that young people does not have power, they have the power, but they need someone to unlock that power. And how do we unlock that? To have program which bring them on board to unleash to unlock their skills, but also to unlock their knowledge on various matters. Because when we are, for instance, I'm working in the communities and sometimes I carry some sessions about gender equality in schools. Students, they don't have that knowledge, but the moment you impart that knowledge to them, they become very energetic and inspired to carry the banner. So several ways is to make sure that we invest in programs which we will unlock the potential of young people, strengthen their skills, but also we have to trust young people. One of the problems in the community, young people are not trusted. They are still like people who are business as usual, staying in the community and other thing. We should and we must trust young people. When we trust them, they show their potential and they prove us wrong many times. And we saw the minister from Sierra Leone. I believe he's a young person. So when
I'm not asking his age.
No, we shouldn't, but by looking at him, you can tell. So we should trust young people. We should invest in programs which will unleash their potential, but also we should challenge policies and laws which are discriminating young people, especially young girls.
Thank you so much, and I really value this conversation with you. We definitely, the United Nations, I can't speak on behalf of the UN speaks for itself, and the UN Women Executive Director will share this as well, but definitely generation equality is also about respecting young people. And I want to just give a shout out to the young people in the world out there. We trust you, we respect you. You are not just leaders of tomorrow, you are leaders of today. You are the innovators, the creators of knowledge. You are professionals, you are experts. And experience of poverty or experience of exclusion does not mean that you don't have wisdom nor do you have dreams. So again, a shout out to all the young people in the world. We love you. Continue to change the world. And thank you, Eva.
And you know, at Restless Development, we call it youth power.
So definitely the power within the power of the collective. Thank you so much, Ebo. Thank you for that deep reflection. I'd like to go back to inviting our Honorable Minister from Argentina, who has joined us. And I'm very excited that the Honorable Minister has been able to join us, and we can continue back in that great conversation with the Honorable Minister, Her Excellency Elizabeth Gomez Alcota, Minister of Women, Gender and Diversity of Argentina. Honorable Minister, welcome. Can you share with us, what are the concrete examples you have and you can share with us to tackle the new and remaining challenges? We know that Beijing was in 1995. And by the way, I went to Beijing. So I feel that 25 years later, so definitely there are new challenges. Definitely there are things remaining. So over to you, Honorable Minister. Which are those new challenges and which are those remaining and how do we tackle them? Over to you, Honorable Minister.
Well, a good day to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to the representatives of the United Nations General Assembly, to the to UN Women and other international partners. I'm sorry I was late coming into the meeting, but we were having some technical difficulties in joining the chat. First of all, I'd like to thank those that have organized this meeting so that virtually it's been possible for us to go through the challenges together that exist today when it comes to gender equality. I'm very proud to represent Argentina, and the Beijing Platform for Action is a great milestone in the recognition of women's rights, and it also strengthens the fundamental principle established in the Vienna Declaration in 1993, namely that the human rights of women are an integral, indivisible part of universal human rights. Specifically, the platform proposes a roadmap for us to implement a number of measures to implement rights related to the autonomy of women to bring about gender equality. These instruments are very important, and they involve a number of concrete actions in order to dismantle inequality and structural inequality, which in different ways but excessively affects everyone, but excessively affects women. So it really is a turning point. And on the basis of that, standards have been developed. And 25 years later, however, 25 years since that historic conference, we still see challenges that exist. And the challenges are getting ever more complicated. In the 12 areas of concern that were mentioned in Beijing, today there is still a lot of inequality. It's not compartmentalized. These are structural inequalities linked to material living conditions for people and the patriarchal systems of our societies. Economic inequality, the existence of high levels of poverty with an exclusive rate of growth for some, not for others, is at the heart of the problem. If we look honestly at gender inequality, we have a problem with the current development model. It's a model which, on the one hand, soaks up all the natural resources, and it has an impact on people's lives, and particularly on the lives of women. We need to think again about development models in order to include the gender perspective and reproductive rights in a very critical way. Gender equality and the definition of development, inclusive development models, needs countries to be present and strong, not only with the ability to design, but also to ensure that these public policies will be implemented. So we need to have capacity, but above all, we need to have willingness to improve the living conditions for people. There still is a clear division between the genders in the workplace. It's very important and very significant, and this has an effect, a knock-on effect on all decision-making positions. We still have patriarchal systems of organization and violence, and we see this particularly in post-colonial societies, and that's the case for a lot of the countries in the region where Argentina is. So we need to take the Beijing platform seriously, have a women's platform, look critically at the means of production. That's my message. This is the political paradigm that is being followed now by the government of Argentina. This is at the basis of our public policy for all forms of social life. 7 months ago, as you may know, we had a change of government in Argentina, and the new administration wanted to address inequality and gender violence. And to do that, for the first time in our history, we created a Women, Gender and Diversity Ministry in order to deal with this at the highest institutional level, in order to close these gaps in all areas. That's our task. Because gender inequality has a daily effect on the life of women. We say that because in Argentina, if the life expectancy of a trans woman is between 35 and 38. That tells you something about the rights of hundreds of thousands of trans women. This has a direct link to the lack of autonomy in people's lives and the roles that are identified to each gender. And we need to realize this is an urgent task, and we need to bring about fundamental cultural changes. We are convinced that everybody has to put their shoulder to the wheel on this. These kinds of things know no geographic borders, and that's why we are promoting a feminist foreign policy in order to have a more in-depth debate on the international stage on these issues. That way we can build alliances with other governments, other peoples that are also committed to gender equality and the rights of women and sexual rights. And this day is particularly relevant in this regard, and I think it gives us hope. It's an ideal platform for us to enter into contact and have an exchange of experiences, as we have been able to, as I've been able to hear this morning for Argentina, and also think about what we need to do to develop gender policies to help society, but above all to bring about a fairer, more egalitarian world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Honorable Minister, and for raising the issues around gender identity and diversity. It's crucial to the conversation. It is important to the conversations around the Beijing platform for action. And it seems the Honorable Minister can she hear? Just confirm. Yes. So to just appreciate your statements around diversity and the importance of the issues that she's raising. And again, talking about diversity and the unfinished business, I think the world in the last 1 month plus, we have been reminded by the Black Lives Matter movement on some of the long-standing historical inequalities also related to race. So the intersectionality of race, gender, class, and all the diversities that we have remains an important issue. And thank you so much, Honorable Minister, for raising these issues with us. I know we have 15 minutes to go and would like then to get some of the comments from the charts that has been shared to us and to open the floor a bit. But Honorable Minister, if there is one thing, which you would say, then for us to go to 2030, this is the one action that is crucial for achieving gender equality, what would it be? What would you say? In the feminist policy, this is the most important action from a feminist foreign policy that we need to take up, Honorable Minister.
Mami me preguntaba. ¿Me preguntaba a mí? ¿Qué dice? Una acción. ¿De qué? I'm sorry. Desde la Argentina.
Well, in Argentina, we're working in particular on the social organization of care. We have an agenda for the first time which enables us to reorganize care services which historically have been invisible. We haven't had public policies to cover these things, and we are committed state actors. We've created an interministerial commission bringing together 6 ministries at the national level and 5 national agencies. One for disability, one related to social care, Ministry of the Economy, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health and Social Development. We're carrying out an initial federal mapping. You know, Argentina is a big country, and each province has its own system, so we need to map these systems so we can coordinate the actions and make the most of what's being done today to see where the gaps are in terms of active policies. We understand that Argentina, like a lot of countries in the world, needs a joint responsibility policy when it comes to caring for the elderly. That joint responsibility is between the state, the private sector, the community and the family. Shared responsibility. And it's also linked to the shared responsibility between the genders. The average number of hours that a woman has for care are 6 hours compared to just 2 hours for men who spend time on care activities. And this difference has an impact on being able to access the economy and access decision-making, and above all, the ability to achieve parity in any area, whether it's in politics, or whether it's in accessing the labour market, education, any area you could think of. For us, equitable distribution of tasks is a strategic thing, because we know that that is what leads to inequality, and that has a direct impact on violence. Unless we deal with this agenda, we can't change the cultural patterns which are affecting the whole situation. We don't want to be working from a defensive point of view. We want to be proactive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Honorable Minister, for that very profound recommendation I know there's some extraordinary work that is also happening with civil society to respond to this issue. And I know that ActionAid International was running a campaign for the last couple of years around the unpaid care work and the importance of investing in public service, that we need our governments to redistribute, to make available and affordable quality public services so that there's water in our homes, so that women do not have to carry water on their heads from long distance. So this is very important, and we really appreciate it, and I'm sure the information from that campaign can be made available. Again, thank you so much, Honorable Minister, for sharing those insights from Argentina. I'd like to go back to Nino Jaria from Georgia. This is a very important conversation, and the office that you hold as the ombudsperson. What do you see as the practices, as the approaches that and the experiences that can be adopted as part of addressing these very critical intersecting forms of discrimination, vulnerability, and marginalization, and in the life of each of us? So over to you, Abel, can you mute your microphone? Thank you. Nino, over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants, this is my honor to take part in this very interesting conversation and discussion, and I'm glad to have opportunity to share experience of my office, how to strengthen women participation and fight against gender equality in my country. Let me first of all begin by underlining that gender equality remains a serious challenge in Georgia, despite the fact that some positive results and steps have taken by the government. Still, we face serious problems. Stereotypes, discriminatory practices are deeply rooted in the society, and most vulnerable group represent LGBT+ community, ethnic and religious minorities, women, victims of domestic violence, women with disabilities, and they are facing additional intersecting discrimination and are particularly vulnerable. And of course, we pay particular attention to the needs of this segment. And I would like to share you one or three positive examples in this regard. Let me start with the extreme form of discrimination against women, femicide, killing on the grounds of gender, which is an issue in my country. In order to implement the recommendation of the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, the Public Defender of Georgia established femicide monitoring mechanism 4 years ago with the technical and financial support of UN Women in Georgia. The aim of this mechanism is to examine the information and statistical data to analyze the effectiveness of the femicide prevention and response mechanisms, as well as to develop recommendations to the relevant state authorities. This monitoring mechanism contributed to important progress with regards developing preventive and response mechanisms to femicide. In terms of discrimination, our findings have proved that gender-based discrimination, including sexual harassment, represented widespread and systemic, and at the same time, hidden practices at workplaces in public and private sectors. We systematically urged the Parliament on the adoption of anti-sexual harassment laws, and as a result, sexual harassment was prescribed as a form of discrimination by law, and Public Defender's Office was granted full mandate to examine the cases not only in public, but also private organizations and companies. And finally, I would like to touch sexual and reproductive health issues and rights of women. The case study of my office revealed that awareness on sexual and reproductive health and rights and access to quality services is very problematic, especially for women with disabilities, ethnic minority groups, LGBT plus community, for women living in rural areas, women living in conflict-affected territories, along with the victims of domestic violence. The monitoring conducted by Public Defender's Office, for instance, in psychiatric institutions, revealed that while providing treatment to patients with mental health problems, sexual and reproductive health needs of women were not taken into consideration and have been largely ignored. Following to our recommendations, the Ministry of Healthcare of Georgia elaborated the guidelines to integrate women's sexual and reproductive health issues into medical protocols for treating patients with mental health problems. There are the issues, of course, other issues that I wanted to touch and share with you, but because of the limited time frame, I'm gonna stop now and I'm ready to answer your questions you may have with me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nina. And I'm happy that you were finally able to connect. You bring very, very important issues around sexual and reproductive health and rights and the linkages with disability and mental health. Just want to come back to, just with the time we have, maybe in 2 minutes or so, we are a traumatized world at this moment. And the women are the most traumatized because of our care responsibility with COVID-19. How to keep safe when the little one wants to jump on you? Can you put a mask on the little one? When we care for the elderly and the loved ones? Can you just share with us what you see as some reflections or some advice on how we can keep healthy and focused in a context of COVID-19, in the context of our sexual and reproductive health roles, and to ensure that our mental health is balanced and we're able to manage when we're burn out. So if you can just share with us some tips, some reflections on that point before we come to summarizing our session.
Well, it's a really difficult question and the issue that you have raised, because COVID-19 pandemic affected negatively every aspect of our life, and women turns to be particularly vulnerable to this situation. Pandemic has deepened the existing inequality in the society. I was listening to other panelists who were talking about the problems of the women regarding the access to labor market and some other problems, and COVID pandemic has, of course, had very negative impacts on the capacity of women to work and ability to work. Because, for instance, in Georgia, women were mostly working in service sector, which is mostly affected sector by pandemic, and also women were migrating. There was internal migration or external migration, seeking some job opportunities, and COVID pandemic also created problems for traveling, and therefore women became socially and otherwise vulnerable. In addition, world data also shows that during pandemic period, the data of domestic violence, the cases have been significantly increased. And when we have heard about this statistic a few months ago, we immediately approached, for instance, to the state institutions, law enforcement agencies. And although there was introduced curfew in Georgia and nobody was allowed to go outside and travel between one city to another, we managed that, for instance, it was allowed to the victims of the violence. We managed that the Ministry of Interior conducted a widespread educational campaign, how women could access to the services, social services or services and assistance from the law enforcement agencies when they needed assistance from these agencies. So I think that this requires joint efforts between state institutions, international organizations, and human rights organizations like NHRIs and civil society organizations. It's really complex topic and issue.
Thank you so much, and thank you for bringing the human rights institutions into the discussions and your reflections, very deep reflections. I want to thank you all so much. To my panelists, we know that we are winding down our panel. We have received so many comments from Brooke Criswell, asking about young women's involvement, from Elena, President of the Medical Association International, raising a range of issues relating to violence against women as well. And from Meera Khanna from India, raising issues of widows, that we should not forget the issues around widows and widows' rights, and how to ensure effective policies that empower. From Beatrice Ferreira, and we also have from Jean Kambongo. So we have a range of questions that are raising issues of resourcing, participation, intersectionality, and I'm sure the next session would carry these issues forward as well in the conversation. Mine is to now bring this session to a close and help me in thanking so much our panelists for this session, our honorable ministers, all our panelists who have been able to make it. And again, we missed Lina on the call. As we close this session, there was clear key messages that came forward. One, that naming issues is important. Naming inequalities and discrimination is important, but it is not sufficient nor transformative enough if it is not accompanied by the appropriate legislation, resources, implementation, monitoring, and accountability. There has to be a package of accountability inbuilt. Secondly, that it's about respecting our diversity and the intersectionality of the range of issues. Thirdly, that COVID-19 is here and it's shaping our future, and we must be part of transforming that future and defining what that future looks like. And lastly, I am an African woman who also serves as the African Union Goodwill Ambassador on ending child marriage. There have been very strong messages around girls and exploitation and abuse, and indeed the commitment to ending the negative, harmful practices. The Gender Equality Leaders Dialogue is now concluded, but before I leave, I invite participants to view a video with images of women from around the world. This short intermission will be followed by the interactive panel discussion entitled Women and Girls, Voices, Participation, and Leadership, moderated by my sister Chidi King, Director of the Equality Department for International Trade Union Confederation. The panel will be starting at 11:45 sharp. Stay tuned. Again, it has been a pleasure, and I want to thank again the United Nations and especially UN Women for inviting me to moderate this panel. And again, thank you to the honorable ministers, to all the panelists, to all the people around the world, and to the frontline responders in COVID-19. And we pray and keep our faith that we will live in a world of equality and human rights for all. I thank you very much.
Welcome to the interactive panel discussion entitled Women's and Girls' Voices, Participation and Leadership. Before proceeding further, I'd like to make some procedural announcements. This meeting is taking place with remote simultaneous interpretation. I kindly ask panelists to be mindful of the additional difficulties experienced by interpreters when working in remote mode and of the increased likelihood of disruptions to the audio feed to the interpreters. Participants may select their preferred language to hear the interpretation or choose the non-option to hear the original language of the speaker. Let me also mention that panelists won't be able to unmute their microphones or engage their video unless given the floor by the moderator. When called upon to speak, the panelists will receive a message indicating that their streaming is approved. Please press the video button appearing in that message in order to share your video and your audio. I'll try to announce speakers two to three at a time. If you face audio or video issues during the meeting, please use the Restart All Lines button above the hand icon, and should the problem persist, do reload your browser. In order to enable everyone to contribute to this dialogue in the best possible manner and to finish on time, I count on your cooperation. I kindly request panelists to keep your replies short and not to exceed 2 to 3 minutes initially for the opening question. Subsequent responses and comments should please be limited to 1 or 2 minutes. And I apologize in advance if I have to interrupt the speakers, and I hope that it won't come to that with your cooperation. I'd also like to remind you that we've posted short biographical information about each speaker on the website, so please do access those. And with all protocol duly and respectfully observed, I'll use panelist titles only once. 2020 is a seminal year for the advancement of women and girls' human rights. We're celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which remains the blueprint for multi-stakeholder action for gender justice. We are, however, celebrating this anniversary in the midst of an unprecedented global health pandemic and its consequential economic and social crises. And we have a looming climate change crisis still with us. The COVID-19 pandemic is exposing and exacerbating existing deep systemic inequalities. And whilst women have been at the forefront of responses to this pandemic as health and social care workers, retail food workers, cleaners, and more, they have also borne the brunt of some of the worst effects of the pandemic, including a surge in domestic violence, a pandemic of itself, the exponential increase in unpaid care and domestic work, and the catastrophic loss of jobs and income. Young women, disabled women, indigenous women, Black women, migrant women, women from LGBTI communities all see the threat of their life chances dwindling further. Yet, if we are to recover from this pandemic stronger and more resilient, their leadership and equitable participation in all spheres of political, social, and economic life will be key. Women and girls from all walks of life are demonstrating leadership skills necessary for transformative change for women and girls and for societies at large. Without these voices, the Beijing Platform for Action And indeed, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development will remain but a distant promise. My name is Judy King from the International Trade Union Confederation, and I'm delighted to introduce a panel of eminent leaders whose insights and expertise can guide us forward. So without further ado, I will give the floor, first of all, to Ms. Aya Chebi, African Union's Envoy on Youth, followed by Ms. Risnawati Utami, member of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and then Ms. Lydia Alpiza Duran, Co-Executive Director, Mexico and Central America Initiative of Women Human Rights Defenders. So Ms. Chebi, from where you sit, what are some of the current challenges facing gender equality leaders and activists, and what opportunities do you see for strengthening their work?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the question. Thank you for the opportunity to share about our work in Africa and the voices of African youth in this discussion. So at the African Union, we convened 22 virtual AU youth consultation on COVID-19 with young people across the continent. And we had over 23,000 participated. And so I'd like to summarize, which is very difficult to do, the outcomes of these consultation into maybe 5 main challenges and therefore recommendations raised by young women in Africa. The first one is unemployment, and the recommendation is really economic resilience and job security. Even before the pandemic, African economies generate only 3 million formal jobs annually for an estimated 12 million youth entering the workforce, and about 60% of jobs in Africa are considered vulnerable. But unfortunately, all the subsidies put in place during COVID-19 are not favoring the informal sector. So we need packages that look at young women in the informal sector and move from economic empowerment to economic resilience. The second biggest challenge has been the digital divide, and the recommendation is digital transformation, because the reality is 70% of Africa's population is offline, and young women and girls are still out of this digital revolution while we all are privileged to be in this digital space, especially refugee, IDP, young women with disability, and of course the inequality between rural and urban youth is very much seen during the pandemic. The third biggest challenge has been in conflict and humanitarian settings in Africa, and the recommendation is to silence the guns. Young women are not just victims and survivors, but also they are peace builders. But their role is merely recognized. The young women in Algeria and Sudan and Cameroon and South Sudan, just to mention a few, have continued their brave work on peace building. So, but recently we have seen a good improvement. The African Union Peace and Security Council adopted on 23rd of June the Continental Framework on Youth Peace and Security, and the UN Security Council also adopted a new resolution. So we're in the right direction, but now we need the implementation at national plans. The fourth and biggest challenge has been for young women in Africa is gender-based violence. Nigeria, South Africa, and Sierra Leone are currently going under a state of emergency on GBV, consisting of domestic violence and rape, and young activists have been mobilizing online and offline to ensure governments duly respond and end impunity, often exasperated by victim blaming. And on this human rights approach as well, we see a lack of access in general, access to free sanitary pads because menstruation is not on quarantine, access to contraceptives, access to ARVs for young women with HIV/AIDS, and so on and so forth. And then the last challenge, also due to time, I just summarize it, is youth exclusion from governance. And the recommendation is intergenerational co-leadership. We see the representation of young women in government decision-making still very low. However, we also see good examples setting a positive precedent. The Namibia example, my sister Emma at 23 is the youngest minister now appointed as Deputy Information Technology Minister. And last week, my sister Amina at the age of 29 is appointed the Minister of Gender in Chad. So we want to see more young women co-leading. And to conclude, young African women also joined the United Nations Secretary General call for ceasefire and silencing the guns as per African Union theme of the year. We just want to see really young people co-leading and contributing to the agenda of peace and gender equality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Chebi's very clear insights there. we'll come back to you on some of those, but I do like your emphasis on silencing the guns and investing in peace and inclusion of youth in decision making, all very key points. So we'll go next to Ms. Utami. What are some of the key issues that women's movements are raising in today's context? And what are the proposed solutions from your perspective?
Thank you, Sidi King. And thank you also for having me and also the opportunity to answer this question. We need to look back in the movement at least a decade ago. At first, the women movement only focused on the women's rights and related issue around women and development. And it did not recognize the intersection between women's rights and disability rights movement yet. But now, I can see the difference that women movements start addressing intersectionality between gender equality, human rights, and disability contexts. My point of view is that the key issue that women's movement raise are now recognize the intersectionality of disability rights and how to position other groups into the movement to achieve equal rights for all. And I think this is a really great milestone for this movement between disability rights movement and women's rights movement. The important issue or key issue that I would like to address is active and meaningful participation of women, including women and girls with disabilities. Why? Because as we know that the active and informed participation of everyone in decisions that affect their lives and rights is consistent with the human rights-based approach in public decision-making processes. This movement benefit for both disability rights and women's movement to voice both rights. In my opinion, that the proposed solution to make both of the movement that I emphasize in the lens of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability are first, women and persons with disability are both facing multiple discrimination, and majority of them are living in poverty line. And often they are not consulted in decision-making about matters relating to or affecting their lives, with decision continuing to be made on their behalf. Therefore, the participation of women, including women and girls with disability in decision-making that affecting their life has strongly to be respected and fulfilled in all aspects of their life. And secondly, I can see to ensure full and effective women's participation that includes women and girls with disability in the context of women movement needs to be taken as a measure to achieve their inclusion in society and to combat discrimination against them. And the third solution that I would like to propose is gender equality cannot be achieved without active and meaningful participation of all women, including women and girls with disability in all sectors of development. And I think this is, I emphasize because this is part of the general comment number 7 of the CRPD that mentioned about active and meaningful participation. And it's very important how we included this important key issues and the solution that I would like to propose in the women's movement. And I can see that now women's movement and disability rights movement are get along very strongly, and we are supporting each other. And I can see there's intersectionality between the CRPD and the CEDAW, how we trying to work together in the movement to eliminating discrimination and gender-based violence. And I can see in Indonesia, it works very well between women's movement and disability rights movement. And I think this is the starting point for the movement that we can work together and we can achieve human rights for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Utami. Again, some very clear recommendations coming from you, especially around the importance of movements working together, taking this intersectional approach, recognizing that not all women are the same and that we need to recognize that different women face different challenges to achieve gender equality, we have to be capable of addressing all these different and intersecting challenges. Thank you again. So next, I will be going to Ms. Alpiza Duran. What policies and strategies have proven to be most successful and impactful in advancing women's and girls' leadership?
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, moderator. I'd like to begin by celebrating the leadership of millions of women around the world who are working tirelessly within their communities at all levels in our societies in order to make radical changes in this world, which is undergoing a number of crises and which is currently facing a very serious pandemic. I've been asked about successful policies and strategies for women's and girls' leadership in Mexico, and I'd like to mention 2 or 3 points given the limited time I have. Firstly, let me say that clearly there are a number of policies and mechanisms at the institutional level which have helped to improve the participation and leadership of women in various policies, in formal decision-making and throughout the state, in the legislative sphere, judicial sphere, etc., as well as within unions and other businesses. Quota systems or parity laws exist. There are a number of affirmative action measures, and these need to be bolstered. We need to have the political support and the financial support to make sure that these measures work. But I think it's very important for us to think about and to work on not just ensuring that more women have access to these key sectors in the political and social fields, but we need to determine which women we're speaking about. And I think that, as the previous speakers have said, it's very vital to ensure that we have diversity of women, women from across the board, women who historically have been marginalized so that they can share their leadership role. I'm speaking about African American women, disabled women, indigenous women, women living in poverty, and women in other marginalized groups. It's not just a question of bringing these women in, it's a question of what agendas they're bringing to the table so that we can really change the patriarchal gender perceptions in our society to ensure radical change, because this thinking has led to a number of crises that we're facing, even leading up to the current pandemic. The second point I'd like to make is that states and governments have a key role to play in creating an environment and a context where women can fully take on their leadership role. Given the data that I've seen, including the United Nations, that women leaders and female defenders are often subject to violence. The statistics are alarming. This takes place at all levels, so we need to stop discriminating against and stigmatizing women who are defenders of rights. We have to put an end to impunity surrounding violence, gender-based violence in our communities. This is at all levels. Egypt, Honduras, Nicaragua, Uganda, throughout the world. We need to have a safe civic space for the political participation of women, for their self-determination, and the rights of defenders need to be recognized as well. This is a key prerequisite so that we can fully ensure the development of leadership for all women in our societies.
Thank you so much, Ms. Alpiza Duran, and thank you again for very clear recommendations for pointing out the role of governments and states in creating and enabling an environment, but also the role of other key actors, including women ourselves. The need for us to have this feminist transformative agenda and to bring that voice to the table. Certainly we will be coming back to discuss some of these issues in a little bit more depth. But I want to turn now to the other three panelists who are with us. Before I do that, I will just indicate to participants that you can ask questions via the event chat. If you want to address your question to a particular panelist, please do indicate that in the chat. But for now, I'm going to turn over to Ms. Jessica Vega Ortega, President of the Global Conclave of Indigenous Youth, promoter and defender of the individual and collective rights of Indigenous peoples. She will be followed by Mr. Jeff Hearn, who's a Senior Professor of Gender Studies at Örebro University in Sweden, and then by Ms. Salam Al-Nukta, Founder and Chief Executive Officer of Changemakers and member of the Beijing Plus 25 Youth Task Force. So Ms. Vega Ortega, Ms. Alpisa Duran just spoke about the important impact that violence and gender-based violence has on the ability of women to exercise their human rights, economic, social, political rights, and how this acts as a key obstacle to achieving gender justice. How can women and girls, change makers and role models be effectively supported in their work for gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls? And how can we prevent a backlash and violence being directed towards them as they do so?
I'd like to begin by extending greetings in my mother tongue. I recognize the resilience of Indigenous peoples, in particular youth, women, and girls in the Indigenous community. They have been the custodians and the preservers of our identity and the wealth of our knowledge, our ancestral knowledge, and our traditional practices and cultures. Indigenous women undoubtedly have been impacted disproportionately. They are 3 times more likely to live in extreme poverty than do non-Indigenous people. Obviously, this does not depend on the region in which they live, either in rural regions or even along international borders. Indigenous women have been a part of the existing structure of violence, but women need to have financial support so that there are safety policies in place to protect them as they play a leadership role. They should not be persecuted or work in fear or in danger. We need to have culturally relevant information so that we can share some of our concepts of the world, because our perception of the world in our Indigenous communities means that we need to speak about the duality of our environment, and we need to have economic power so that we can ensure the full rights of Indigenous women and girls. We have a very specific approach when it comes to caring for disabled African American and Indigenous women and those sectors of the population that have been discriminated against and who have been impacted to a greater extent by violence. How can we react given this particular situation? Well, we need to create a space for dialogue with leaders in various states, international organizations, and with society in general. It's absolutely essential to recognize and to have efficient legal frameworks so that public policies can be established and genuine and effective mechanisms can be set up at all levels in the community and in the state. We need to protect and promote the human rights of women and guarantee individual rights to ensure the empowerment of women so that they have access to the law and to social justice. And this is for women at all stages of life. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, thank you for those very valuable insights. And I think you, again, have really underlined the importance of taking an intersectional approach to questions of public policy, to questions of law, to questions of anything we need to do in order to achieve a real response to the challenges that are preventing women from accessing and enjoying our human rights. I'm going to turn next to Mr. Hearn. So Mr. Hearn, of course, women are not alone in this, and women are not alone in creating the obstacles. In fact, they're not even at the forefront of creating these obstacles. So if things are going to change, we of course need the participation of men and boys. So how can men play a proactive role in supporting women's leadership and tackling gender stereotypes and negative social norms?
Thank you very much. Let me first say it's a great honor to be invited to be talking today, a great privilege, I would say. And so my question is just how can men be proactive in supporting women's leadership and in other ways? And increasing and deepening women and girls' empowerment means urgent, profound change in gender relations, obviously between women and men, girls and boys, with non-normative genders and sexualities, but also, I would say, relations between men, different kinds of men. And this involves what I would call a double take. On the one hand, it involves naming men's power, entitlement and privilege in both public and in private situations. But it also, on the other hand, it involves, I would say, taking apart common and fixed assumptions and norms around men. Men are not only men, actually. Men are essentially not one thing. Men are diverse, if you like, intersectional, with very, very different groups of men. Men can be supportive at all levels and in multiple ways. And this means fundamental changes in what it means to be a man and in masculinity. It means listening to and learning from girls and women. It means being collaborative and accountable to women, avoiding reproducing inequalities in that support. It involves raising awareness and challenging other men, stopping being sexist, racist, ageist, ableist, misogynist, obviously ending violence of all kinds, and the issue about guns, I think, is really important, as mentioned already, and instead doing what I would call peaceful masculinity. It involves ending patriarchal ways of being and doing, and patriarchal distributions of resources, both structurally and personally. This agenda of changing men is needed in, I would say, all spheres and all arenas, and ranging from everyday life to global inequalities and climate change and other global issues. It involves changing in families, in communities, in valuing and doing and taking responsibility for care work, as shown so graphically by the COVID crisis. Obviously, it involves education and advocacy for gender justice, and in all ranges of organizations and workplaces and other organizations, the state, business organizations, religious organizations, sporting organizations. It involves encouraging what I would call as a shorthand, new caring masculinities at both home and work. And importantly, it involves in civil society, NGOs, intervention projects, particularly preventative projects, campaigns on media and social media. And I'll mention here especially the work of the Men Engage Alliance with the symposium in Kigali in Rwanda in the mid-November, and involves changing state policy at all levels and implementing that firmly. And just to sort of conclude, I would say transforming men worldwide is part, actually, not only of women and girls' empowerment, but achieving social development goals more generally. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hearn. I think there are lessons for all of us, men and women, in what you have just outlined, and certainly again this issue of intersectionality and recognizing and owning one's privilege and entitlement, and seeing how this plays into creating inequalities and injustices is key to achieving this transformative agenda that we're all talking about and wanting to work towards. Let me turn now to Ms. Al Nukta. Salam, your name means peace. We're very pleased to welcome you. What are the key demands from women and youth and civil society organizations for a Build Back Better post this COVID-19 immediate health emergency? Looking to the future, what do we need to do?
Thank you very much, Shiri, for an amazing moderating and facilitating for this session. And thank you for having me, of course. Before I answer your question, I'd like to tell you, and of course, everyone knows that the COVID-19 pandemic did not bring new inequalities. It only exacerbated the already existing ones. And a simple rule in economics tells us to measure nominal values and then reflect fluctuations before bringing any policy. So the original gender inequalities are actually the nominal ones, and I doubt the accuracy these nominal inequalities has been adjusted to reflect the impact of COVID-19. That's only due to the very rapid changes, and hence a major demand would be to evaluate these fluctuations in severity of those inequalities, considering the different contexts. And without a strategy put in place, I see it hard to propose a mitigation and a recovery approach. Moreover, it has been a very insightful journey for me living in two different communities. Just like a person who sat on both sides of the shore by spending a quarter of a century in Syria, and that's 25 years, of course, then moving to the Netherlands for a fresh start. I'm witnessing huge gaps and differences in what women and also young people need, which also takes me to the point that progress has indeed been uneven and even stalled in some areas, just as mentioned in the statement before, because of the selective behavior of organizations and media. The world is overlooking the continuous need of some girls in specific communities to access proper education rather than go to an exchange program, for example, and others are still advocating for the rights to have enough sanitary napkins to survive their periods. Some women in other communities are still deprived their basic human rights while these societies are worshipping male supremacy. Again, and just like you mentioned before, and everyone else is stressed, I want to re-emphasize that inequalities can take different forms, and it definitely affects men as well as women. I'll give it back to you, and then I would love to actually suggest a few proposals on how to build a better collaborative environment, seeking a better world.
Thank you very much, and we'll definitely come back to you on that for that vision. So look forward to that. I want to go back. I haven't seen any questions come through from the chat yet, so I just want to go back and give our speakers the opportunity to amplify some of the comments that they have already made. And perhaps I can go to Ms. Utami first of all, if you're still with us. And your emphasis on the need for movements to come together and again recognize the different challenges that different women face really resonated. One of the things that perhaps we don't see enough, though, is this being reflected in public policy. So if you were to craft a public policy agenda that was going to take account of the needs of disabled women, again, in all their diversity, whether they be Black disabled women or migrant disabled women or disabled women from LGBTI communities, what would you say are some of the key things that governments need to be paying attention to in crafting those policies?
Thank you. It's very interesting questions because I would like to go back on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability when it comes to the government obligation to protect all women and girls with disability in particular. And in the CRPD, we recognize all the differences, the diversity of all persons with disability, whether they are Black or white, indigenous, and this type of differences. And as mentioned in the Article 4 about the government obligation that the government should provide legal harmonization in terms of the CRPD, how the CRPD principle adopted into the all national and local policies and law to protect the human rights of women and girls with disability. In terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, I would say that here in my country, there is increased number in terms of violence against women, in particular women with disability. And the domestic level, they have been facing a difficulty and also violence. And I think this is still hidden, data and hidden facts that happening, and I'm sure it's happening all around the world. And I really strengthen and emphasize for all state parties that ratify the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, create a measure taken to provide law and regulation to protect the women and girls with disability. Because in Indonesia, for example, we don't have law on sexual violence yet. But in fact, we already ratified the convention, the CRPD and CEDAW. Even the CEDAW we have ratified about 36 years ago. Can you believe that? So this is like, there is something gap that is still, very big, and we need to address how the importance of legal harmonization and how to adopt the CRPD principles and also the CEDAW principle about the government obligation in order to create a measure taken in terms of law and regulation, and also policy development, including budget allocation on how to protect women and girls in all sectors, including how to make their human rights to be respected and fulfilled, also protected by the states. Thank you. I hope I answered the questions.
I think you did. Thank you so much for that. I want to go back next to you, Jeff, to Mr. Hearn, because a question has come through from the chat and specifically addressed to you. And the question was, if I can find it, is what examples of education and advocacy for gender justice are men and organizations doing to deliver caring masculinities? And I think you already touched a little bit on that, so maybe you can expand.
Yes, I'll try and keep it short. The term caring masculinities has become, so to speak, used quite a lot in recent years as a way of summarizing a different way of thinking about the way masculinity has been or is still in many parts of the world. And I think it's useful, and it's been used certainly within the EU and in Europe, but I think it's also used further afield now. And it's a way of thinking, you could say, more positively about ways in which, if you like, boys don't have to be boys in the same way in which they've been in many parts of the world, and men likewise. So it's, in one sense, it's opening up different ways of thinking about that, different ways of doing masculinity. And this is very important, obviously, at all parts of the life course. But I mean, perhaps it's most obvious in terms of working in schools and with young men, but I wouldn't just see it only as limited to younger generations. I actually think change in older men and old men is actually something really, really important that needs to be put on the agenda. There are many examples of projects. I mentioned Men Engage Alliance, which I think is a really good umbrella alliance of many other networks and projects, and I recommend it for those who don't know about it. But also, I mean, there are many other projects, and I was saying the global, so-called Global South, Stepping Stones, Sonke Gender Justice, Promundo, and I could go on, Carryman in the Caribbean, Men Care, and so on. So there are many, many, and nowadays, for those who have access to the internet, as has been raised already as an issue, there are a lot of resources online for different, you could say, boys, young men, much less actually for older men. But I think resources are there, and if people really want them, they can email me anytime. You can find my email address, and I will gladly send you lots and lots. Okay.
Thank you for that. I'm sure a few people will be taking.
Really. I mean that as well. And if you want my email, I can repeat it. It's hearn@hanken.fi.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jeff. I'm sure some people will definitely be taking you up on that. I wanted to go back to Lydia next. Lydia, with another question that has come through our chat, and this is about multilateralism. and the fact that multilateralism today is facing an unprecedented menace, if you like, and that women and girls are amongst those most acutely affected by this unilateral approach that governments are taking, reneging on international agreements and taking this much more nationalistic approach. So what are your thoughts on how we can ensure that voices of women and girls in particular can still be heard and can help to reinforce governments' obligation to observe international treaties, particularly human rights treaties, and to uphold their commitments through multilateral engagement?
Sí, muchas gracias, Chi.
Thank you very much for that question. I think that's a very important question, in particular during the pandemic, because there's a lack of international cooperation, multilateralism, solidarity, and that's one of the greatest weaknesses that we've seen. And I think that one of the weaknesses that is actually impacting an effective response to the pandemic worldwide. And I think Armenia is showing us the way. They've talked about structural inequalities and the major challenges that we're facing in the multilateral system and global governance. I don't think we can answer the question just by referring to women's participation, because we women need to be at the table with other sectors. Rather, we need to speak about the level of global governance that the world is seeking so that we can respond effectively. I think that the structural crises we're facing now cannot be dealt with properly from a unilateral standpoint. And I think the global system is facing a major crisis. So it is very important to ensure that women leaders who are playing an important role, for example, in various governments and within civil society, it's important for them to be at the discussion table and to discuss reforms in global governance. However, and this is actually something that we commented on last week when we were discussing these issues, we need to make a radical change in this world in crisis. And we need to fight against authoritarianism and various approaches that weaken the global governance system. So it's very important for us to continue the battle, to continue the struggle, to be part of the negotiations at all levels. And we need to ensure that women have a much more significant role to play and participate much more. We need to have the participation of women's groups, women leaders, in all of their diversity, in all spaces. It's not a question of discussing how to improve upon governance and multilateralism, but we should be saying, what are these times requiring us to do? What are the alternatives that we can bring to the table? Because the current system has brought us to where we are now. Thank you.
You loud and clear that we can't just tinker around the edges and mend what's broken or try to improve what's broken. We really need, for this transformation, we need to rethink and to reimagine our global governance system. And women have to be very much part of that with this feminist approach, feminist agenda. It has to happen at national level, but also at international level in international spaces. Thank you. So next I'm going to come back to Jessica. I hope you're still with us, Jessica. A question that has been asked, and I think you emphasized some of these points during your initial presentation, is how do we handle the intersections of race, gender, and other dimensions of difference and vulnerability? What could be some of the prescriptions we can bring to ensure that these issues are addressed effectively? And I hope Jessica is still with us. There you are. Hi, Jessica.
Hello. In answering that question, I'd like to say firstly that the pandemic has certainly shed light on profound inequalities in a number of sectors for Indigenous women, in many sectors of society. And that is why it is important for us to be able to link up these sections and these issues as they relate to women. There is existing violence against women. There's a high rate, it's led to a high rate of femicide, and there's a lack of justice for women. So we need to speak about the vacuum when it comes to policies at the national level dealing with these specific issues of violence against women, for example. There has to be a focus on the importance of various cultures. There are some rights that have been acquired rights for women, but we need to identify where the problems lie. For example, a lack of a medical center in certain areas, and that puts women in some areas on an unequal footing. These women are then left alone to face other difficulties. They have trouble having access to basic rights such as education. There are different realities and they need to be identified. We can't just be living on the defensive all the time. We need to learn and develop our own potential in a free environment. We need women who are decision makers in strategic spaces. We need more women at the national level, women who are not afraid to be leaders because they may well face a policy of violence. We need to rethink how we see the world. And that's why it's important to speak about a generation of equality where everyone, men and women, everyone is taken into account. We need to hear the voices from the indigenous communities, but women can't do this alone. We need to join our forces. We need to join communities, bring everyone together so that we're speaking on behalf of all sectors of the population. I think we need to create this new space for dialogue, and that's the way we will accelerate achievement of Agenda 2030, and that the issue of leaving no one behind will not just be a slogan, it will be a reality. Thank you.
Very clear, and I heard very loudly what you were saying about can't always live defensively. You know, it's time now to change this, to flip this. It's time that women in all our diversity are given this seat at the table to participate in this transformation, in this reimagining, in this rethinking of how things are done. The need to identify where problems lie so that action can be properly targeted and tailored to address those problems, to find the solutions to those problems. And I think that's something that all our panelists have touched on to one degree or another, the importance of having this data. And I think, you know, governments to intentionally go about collecting this data. We often talk about sex disaggregated data, but we need to disaggregate that data along other lines to see how other communities and how other people are being affected by policies or the lack of policies, by legislation or the lack of legislation, and take deliberate action to address that. Thank you very much. I want to go back next to Ms. Aya Chabi. A question specifically addressed to you, Ms. Chabi. You had mentioned that one key issue is implementation of policies to address these systemic and structural inequalities. COVID is a challenge, but also offers a space to engage with governments to work with women in the response and long-term recovery. So the question that was being asked of you is, how are you partnering with youth and women organizations in countries to influence policies? And are there any partnerships in that sense already existing on the continent?
Thank you for that question. Maybe I'll start with why are we here? Why we're not implementing policies yet? I think, first of all, as young women, we're inspired by women leadership around the world during this pandemic. I don't think it's a coincidence that all countries led by women had effective response. And I want to believe that female leadership is collaborative, is emotionally intelligent, is for multilateralism and not competitiveness. It's thinking of us as a humanity, because none of us will be safe until all of us are safe, and all of that. So I've been very inspired as a young woman myself with all these women leadership during the pandemic. And I think now we have very progressive policies. We have Maputo Protocol, we have the African Union Strategy on Gender and Women Empowerment, we have CEDAW, we have UN Security Council Resolution 2250, AU Peace and Security Council Framework on Youth Peace and Security, endless progressive policies, whether at the continental level or at the global level. But what young people are asking for is results. And I think in order to see results, we need leadership. We need leadership that is accountable. We need representativity. We need leadership that is genuine about dismantling inequality, not perpetrating patriarchy. We need leadership that is promoting citizen engagement, community engagement. And we need bold leadership that listens to young people, because young people are the experts of their own reality. And they're the ones on the front line, and particularly African youth. I think they have shown an extraordinary leadership during the pandemic. They're the ones who have been doing door-to-door and distributing masks and so on and so forth. So I think in terms of what we are trying to do to shift that as well from at least where I sit in the African Union and promoting this idea of intergenerational co-leadership, and practicing what we're preaching, is we established beginning of May what we call the African Youth Front on Coronavirus. So it's an innovation approach, and it actually makes the African Union the first and only intergovernmental organization that created a space for young people to co-lead continental response to the pandemic. And I think that is one way we're showing our member states. We had the ministerial meeting of youth ministers just a few weeks ago, and we were calling as well to have that space for young people at the national level. We can do much at the continental level, but the work is at the community level, the work at the national level. And what we try to do is to use the digital space and the young people we can reach right now to that have that ripple effect, so they can bring in their communities, their grassroots initiatives, their innovation, and we can advocate at the continental level for them to be recognized and to be amplified. But I think the collaborative spirit and the partnership and the multilateralism, it cannot be emphasized enough in this global pandemic, honestly. And I think we need, as young people, as a generation as well, we are products of systems that are not working, and we can become products of those systems. And I think the call to my peers here is that we need to be the ones who change the system. We cannot continue doing business as usual, and that only will be possible with our solidarity, with our intersectionality, with our collaboration as a generation.
Thank you again. Very strong and very clear words. We need a new normal, no business as usual, and that new normal has to be a gender equal new normal. And I heard you very clearly. We have the instruments, we have the tools. What's lacking is the leadership and the accountability of leadership, indeed, and the implementation of the policies that are embedded in these instruments. I also heard you say as well that the leadership, in fact, is already out there. It's already, leading, but it's just not included in the traditional structures, the structures that dominate, the structures, the power structures, if you like. So again, radical change needed in that respect. I'm conscious that we're coming to the end of our time, so I wanted to go back with the last question to Ms. Salam Al-Nukta, and I know Salam, you had wanted to come back on some points that you had originally. I just want to add to that a question we got from participants. With weak educational and training structures in place in most developing nations, what would you say are top 3 areas youth activists should be focused on for a bright future for themselves? If you could integrate that into your final response in, let's say, three minutes, that would be great.
Sure. I'll get back to your question after after giving an overview of what I think organizations should be doing and where they should be focusing. So areas we need to look into vary, of course, and here are a few examples of questions we need to measure the responses. So first of all, how did working from home affect gender roles? Of course, I've seen different campaigns which try to equalize gender roles. But we all know that social media targets elite, and its impact is often reversed. So that's one question that I'd like to have more accurate data on. The other is, how did the new enforced lifestyles having to work from home affected our day-to-day interactions, whether at home or among couples and also in marriages? Pretty much I'm very interested in divorce and domestic violence among other rates, and I think that these rates are very good starting points to explore the roots of the problem. And then finally, a few suggestions I would like to propose for a better collaborative environment, seeking a better world. First of all, I think that advocates and individuals and organizations should not be perceived as fighters against, or even sometimes enemies to cultures. On the contrary, we should embrace and support their causes by coming to an understanding that we're working together to build an advanced civilization where facilities and opportunities are equally accessible to everyone. Another point is that organizations working at the grassroots levels must not be undermined. Conversely, they must be supported, mentored, and well established to facilitate and seek the public's acceptance of new policies and legislations. Without this step, I think that governments and policymakers will continue to suffer disconnection from with the public. And then the last point is that I think that it's naive to think that a one size or one strategy fits all. Needs vary depending on the context, country, community, demographics, etc., of course. So we must not ignore these differences, but seek to learn them in order to come up with a comprehensive and customized strategy. Moreover, development happens at different levels. So it's very important for the various organizations to keep communication and the conversation going to exchange lessons learned. And then to come back to your question, top areas that I think education, as far as I understand, that education must focus for young people to come up, of course, with good leadership for women, right? I think it's very important to not be disconnected from the world, and today's world requires high interpersonal skills and, of course, technological skills. These two areas are very important, and from a very young age, I think that children they need to be raised to be able to express themselves freely, and also respectively. They should not be raised to be, they should not be raised to not know how to deliver or communicate their ideas well. So I think the two areas are definitely the interpersonal skills and technology, which we still lack to see in the current schools curriculums.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Salam. Lydia, I'm going to come back to you with one last critical question before we wrap up this session. which is what are the best practices regards to protection for women's women's rights defenders or women's human rights defenders? A big question for you, but yeah, the final question of this. If I can give you a minute, please, Lydia, to address that question. Yeah, not a lot of time for a big question. Over to you.
Yes, no, thank you. A very important question indeed. Well, I think that there are several best practices, and the work of the last rapporteur of the UN, Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders, specifically addressing women's human rights defenders, has a really good list of recommendations. So I want to point people to that report. But first, I think it's very important to fight impunity. As I was mentioning, the level of aggressions against women's human rights defenders around the world, it's increasing. Even in the midst of the pandemic, for example, in Central America and Mexico, we had 6 women defenders killed, for example. So extreme forms of violence are not in quarantine. So it's very important that we end impunity and that we ensure access to justice for all the aggressions against women's human rights defenders. And in that, states are so important, as I was mentioning before, because, for example, in our region, about 60% of aggressions are coming from state actors. So that's one. 2, it's very important that we celebrate and recognize the contributions that women's human rights defenders are making at all levels of society, and that we fight stigmatization and criminalization at different levels. So states themselves and other actors are very important in ensuring that society recognizes the value of women's human rights defenders' contribution to society. That's a second thing. Third, non-state actors like religious fundamentalists, like transnational corporations, for example, extractive industries, like corporate media, play major roles in violence and criminalization against women's human rights defenders. So it's very important, again, that society as a whole and states ensure that there is no impunity against the aggressions that these actors are playing, and that we can put a stop to that. Finally, women ourselves are building networks, are building movements, are leading different struggles around the world. The questions of protection and security are central to the work that we're doing today because of the very violent nature of the context itself. So supporting and ensuring that there is resources and political support at all levels for those networks and organizations is really crucial, because we need to redefine the way in which we do care, in which we do protection, and put this agenda as central at all levels of society.
Thank you so much, Lydia, and very strong and good words, I think, to wrap up this session with. So I would like to express my deep appreciation again to all the panelists for their active participation in this panel discussion, very rich, very insightful. To all participants who have also contributed to a fruitful discussion, and of course to our interpreters who have enabled us to communicate with each other. The recipes for this transformational change, I think, were very clearly set out. A very clear roadmap was set out for us during this panel discussion. And what stays with me is that we do have the tools, if you like, that we need to put us on this path. What we need now is accountability. What we need now is implementation. What we need now is, for women to be present in all our diversity in these decision-making situations, and not just to be there for the sake of being there, but to bring this feminist agenda, this feminist vision, this transformation, to rethink the way we do global governance, to silence the guns, to end impunity, to be intentional and deliberate about an intersectional approach, to be collaborative, emotionally intelligent in our approach to leadership, and to recognize the role of privilege and entitlement in creating and maintaining systems of oppression, and the role that all of us need to play in consciously dismantling those systems of oppression. The next interactive panel discussion is entitled, this panel discussion is concluded, but before we leave, let me invite participants to view a UN Women video on 25 years of progress on gender equality prepared on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the Fourth World Conference on Women. This video will be followed by the interactive panel discussion on achieving gender equality is everyone's responsibility. And I invite you all to stay online for that discussion. It's moderated by Mr. Eddie Ndupu, who's the United Nations Secretary General's Global Advocates for the Sustainable Development Goals and Humanity and Inclusion's Global Ambassador. Thank you all very much for your participation, and goodbye.
The year was 1995.
I declare the NGO Forum on Women open!
Women's movements and NGOs asked for, and governments adopted, a visionary agenda for gender equality. The Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action called for systemic change to realize the rights of women and girls around the world. It was a promise by the nations of the world to end gender-based violence, secure girls' rights, ensure equal pay for work of equal value, increase women's participation in decision-making, and end women's poverty. 25 years later, as the UN turns 75, we have seen some progress. Our world has changed since Beijing, yet no country has fully achieved gender equality as we enter the decade of action to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. This is our wake-up call. It's time to end gender-based violence, to make the economy work for women, to accelerate women's participation in decision-making and peace-building, and to invest in feminist movements and leadership. It's time to renew our commitments and take decisive action to make gender equality a lived reality in this generation. The time is now, and we must act together.
Hello again, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce the next panel discussion on achieving gender equality is everyone's responsibility. This discussion is moderated by Mr. Eddie Ndopu, the United Nations Secretary General's Global Advocates for the Sustainable Development Goals and Humanity and Inclusion's Global Ambassador. I will hand over now to Mr. Eddie Ndopu. Thank you. I think we're just waiting a little bit for Mr. Ndopu to come online. Whilst we're waiting for that, I'll just remind participants that you can listen to the next discussion in the language of your choice by selecting that under the interpretation button. If you don't want interpretation, select none. Otherwise, do select the language of your choice. And whilst again we're waiting for this to be facilitated, I'll just guide you through the speakers for this next panel. We have Umberto Carollo, Global Co-Chair of Men Engage and Executive Director of White Ribbon. We have also Anthony Kidi, who's the Program Manager of Masculinities and Engaging Men in Gender Equality, ABAAD, Resource Center for Gender Equality of the MENA region. We will have also Misun Wu, Regional Coordinator of the Asia Pacific Forum of Women in Law and Development, Stefan Lurk, CEO of the World Federation of Advertisers and founding member of the On Stereotype Alliance, and Martha Lucia Michacamarena, Member of Parliament and leader of the Gender Commission of the Upper House of Mexico. Thank you. The following issues will be addressed under this theme: the role of men and boys in realizing gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls in the decade of action and delivery to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. Everywhere, unequal power relations, gender stereotypes, and practices that perpetuate discrimination against women and girls persist. On average, women do 3 times as much unpaid care and domestic work as men, which indicates the unequal sharing of responsibilities. Male violence against women and girls is persuasive. Almost everywhere, women are underrepresented in positions of power and decision-making. And the COVID-19 pandemic is deepening existing inequalities, and levels of violence against women and girls are increasing globally. This calls for renewed efforts to address the root causes of gender inequality and for men and boys to become agents of change in the gender-responsive implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and to build back better from COVID-19. Multi-stakeholder partnerships for gender equality and women's and girls' rights, collaboration between various stakeholders has been crucial to advance the implementation of gender equality commitments, to articulate women's interests in public policies and enhance institutional accountability. Non-governmental actors, especially women's organizations, have advocated to advance legislation, public policies, and their funding and implementation. Other actors, such as the media, academia, trade unions, and the private sector, also contribute to this common goal. More work is needed to ensure accountability of all stakeholders to deliver on commitments and to support and strengthen the capacity of women's organizations to hold decision makers to account for results. So I hope we are now ready to move to the next panel session. As our guests and moderator not yet on screen, I will inform you of the guiding questions that have been suggested for this next panel. Panel will look at effective policy interventions so that boys grow up to become allies and agents of change for gender equality, and how such efforts are being stepped up in COVID-19 response and recovery frameworks. How can male role models contribute to addressing discriminatory attitudes and behavior patterns? What role can the media play in transforming negative social norms and gender stereotypes? What are examples of successful partnerships between actors to accelerate implementation of gender equality commitments? And how is such collaboration evolving in the light of new challenges and opportunities in the COVID-19 recovery process? How can partnerships between different stakeholders contribute to meeting commitments to gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls and realization of their human rights? And as I mentioned before, we have a very exciting panel lined up to answer some of these questions. I think we're just having a few technical problems at the minute. So I will start perhaps by at least trying to kick off this session while we wait for others to come on stream. And the first question, if I can, I would like to address to our senator from Mexico. And that's a question concerning partnerships. And it was, what are examples of successful partnerships between actors to accelerate implementation of gender equality commitments? And how is such collaboration evolving in the light of new challenges and opportunities in the COVID-19 recovery process? If I can ask the senator first to address that question. I think we're still having some technical issues. If the senator is not yet online, perhaps I can then go. Let's try. We'll see whether we get the next speaker on house. Let me try again with Marta Lucia Micha Camarena, who's a member of parliament and leader of the Gender Commission of the Upper House of Mexico. Marta, are you online? Are you with us? Apparently not yet. Maybe then I can see if Stefan Locher, the CEO of the World Federation of Advertisers and founding member of the Unstereotype Alliance, is connected. Stefan, are you with us?
Hear me?
Thank you. That's great. Thank you for being with us. I'll ask you the same question then. I know that you're from the world of I would ask you the same question that we were hoping to hear from the senator on, which is a question on partnerships. I don't know if you heard it before. You need me to repeat it?
Could you please repeat it? I only heard the end of the question.
Okay, no worries. How can partnerships between different stakeholders contribute to meeting commitments to gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls and realization of their human rights?
I think partnerships are essential, and I will be speaking or responding to your question from the perspective of business, which is the stakeholders I'm representing in this panel. So I'm representing advertisers, so the brands which communicate with people and which run advertising campaigns. Advertising influences culture, culture shapes norms, and norms shape behavior. And therefore, advertising has a role in promoting positive role models, both for women and for men. We are founding members of the Unstereotype Alliance, which is an initiative which was launched by UN Women and its executive director, Phumzile Mlambo Nguka, 3 years ago. And through that initiative, UN Women has been able to raise awareness in the industry with respect to the responsibility of the industry in shaping more positive norms, more gender equal norms. And there have been cases where regulators have decided to go other paths. You could imagine regulators promoting regulatory interventions or promoting through other means the agenda. What was interesting in this approach is it is a collaborative approach. And while acknowledging that a lot of progress still needs to be made, it is interesting to see that over the last 3 years, that collaborative approach has been generating a very significant change in the industry. And let me maybe explain why I think it has been able to do so and what the important conditions are for success. One is it has started from a very honest and challenging assessment of the current situation. Our industry, which prides itself to be very future-facing, very modern, is actually, with respect to gender stereotyping, very conservative, very backward-looking. And by making that very clear and challenging, at times even shocking assessment to the industry, it was able to shake the tree. Secondly, that offer of a partnership, which was based on a positive partnership in terms of let us embrace the challenge for us to be succeeding together, that was done on the basis of clear metrics. So it's not only a sort of statement of intention, it also goes hand in hand with an obligation to measure on whether the different efforts are achieving what they're set out to achieve, which is a more gender equal portrayal of people, of women in particular. And the metrics are globally consistent, and they're being applied by all the signatories. Therefore, there is accountability, which is very important in order to build the necessary trust. And then finally, the agenda is driven in a positive manner, in the sense that there is a societal obligation and mandate to be addressing what is a deep-seated historic injustice. And at the same time, there's also an agenda for growth and opportunity for brands, because that's what many, many people and consumers are expecting from brands, to be taking a stance which is seen to be addressing some of the important issues which we're facing as a society. So I think these three conditions for partnership, so one, honest and clear assessment of the situation, two, metrics in terms of holding accountable signatories, and three, a positive agenda for change, which actually looks at the opportunity, I think have been three very important driving forces behind that uncommon partnership which UN Women has launched with on stereotype.
Thank you very much, and thank you for stepping into the breach with some very important observations about the need for this positive agenda for change, and again hearing the need for accountability, the role that different actors can play in all of this. I will come back to you all if our moderator is able to join us. I'm sure he will come back to you specifically on the role of the media. But next, perhaps I can turn to Misun Wu, who's the Regional Coordinator for Asia Pacific Forum of Women in Law and Development. And I'd like to ask you, if you're with us, Misun, the same question. Again, what are examples of successful partnerships between actors to accelerate implementation of gender equality commitments? And how is such collaboration evolving in the light of new challenges and opportunities in this COVID-19 recovery process?
Thank you very much, Lydia, for Chidi, for staying with us, and dear colleagues and friends, it's such a privilege and responsibility to be with you here on the panel. Women's human rights and gender equality is a question of power, and partnership and other initiatives must aim at shifting power relations for women and girls in all their diversities to hold power inherent to them as right holders, to make decisions over their own bodies, communities, and the planet. For any partnership to work, it requires courage and critical reflection to recognize our own power within, to exercise and to impart that power to others. There needs to be recognition of historical and systemic oppression, exclusion, and marginalization of others, and action to redistribute power, wealth, and opportunities. A real partnership lies with women and their communities with power to effect changes from local to the global levels. Following the recommendation from the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, women in Asia and the Pacific have been using Feminist Participatory Action Research, FPAR, as a tool to build movements. The essential ingredients for any partnership are consent, engagement, and trust of women and their communities. Genuine partnership only exists and can work where we exercise solidarity with shared vision. With FPAR, women have challenged patriarchal norms and become recognized as leaders. They have influenced electoral processes, amended laws on inheritance, property, and divorce rights, organized protest actions for decent work, social protections, and maternity benefits, secured public market spaces for privatization, put women with disabilities agenda at the core of local government's development plans, successfully suspended core power plant plans, and led resistance against mega hydropower projects that could erase the livelihoods of indigenous women and their communities. FPAR has also revealed partnership between communities and governments to realize energy democracy. Remote communities do not need corporations to provide electricity. They can set up and manage nano or micro sustainable energy systems. The Asia-Pacific Regional Civil Society Engagement Mechanism, APRSM, has shown the power of organized cross-constituencies and movements. With a shared vision and commitment to development justice and led by feminist movements, APRSM generated the recognition of structural barriers to sustainable development and institutionalize civil society, particularly grassroots participation in SDGs processes. Civil society partnerships with women journalists can change public narratives by amplifying the voices, experiences, and solutions of women and change existing tropes. Democratic systems of engagement, consultation, and accountability must be shaped and agreed upon with active participation and leadership of diverse women and their communities. In this context, the biggest challenge the COVID-19 poses is to women's organizing work. Arbitrary restrictions, surveillance, and new security laws to suppress dissent are in force, while neoliberal forces continue securing power and profits. I remind us of the call for actions made in Beijing for governments to exercise regulatory power over corporations, to reject public-private partnership, which has been promoted under the guise of multi-stakeholder partnerships, and to expand public-public partnership to realize government's human rights obligations as duty bearers and people's sovereignty as right holders. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Sun, and thank you again for a very clear presentation. I heard you, the need to redistribute power, wealth, and opportunities came out very clearly. And from that, I'm really happy to say that the chair of this panel discussion is finally with us. So very welcome to you, Eddie. Mr. Eddie Ndopo is the United Nations Secretary General's Global Advocates for the Sustainable Development Goals and Humanity and Inclusion's Global Ambassador. Welcome, Eddie. Just so that you know, we have had interventions from Stefan and then just now from Ms. Sun. Over to you, and thanks again.
Thank you so much. Please accept my apologies for the technical issues. This is the age of video conferencing, and so please do bear with me. I am super delighted to be part of this very dynamic conversation around gender equality being everyone's responsibility. Thank you so much to the panelists who have made interventions prior to my arrival. I'd like to turn over to Senator Marta for interventions. Much has been said, Senator, about the pandemic within the pandemic. And of course, here we are referring to the surge in gender-based violence and intimate partner violence. If you will, Senator, please speak to that. And also, if you could talk a little bit about the partnerships, multi-stakeholder partnerships, be it civil society, the private sector, the public sector, speak to the kinds of multi-stakeholder partnerships that you believe will be required in this moment to accelerate the commitment towards gender equality for women and girls everywhere. I give the floor to you, Senator. Do we have Honorable Mata with us? Oh, I think we're having some issues. Okay, while we wait for the senator to rectify some of the technical issues, perhaps I'll turn it over to Humberto. Humberto, if you could speak a little bit to the importance of the intervention of men around the fight for gender equality, and specifically what you believe the effective policy interventions will be so that boys can become allies in the fight for gender equality, and what these efforts mean within the broader context of COVID-19.
Gracias.
Absolutely. The senator's with us. Sorry, 1 second. Thank you, Senator. Apologies. We're all having technical problems today. Did you manage to get my question earlier?
Sí.
Yes. I'm going to speak Spanish.
Speak in Spanish.
No problem.
Okay. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much to the PGA for organizing this event and for inviting us here. Greetings to all of my colleagues on the panel here and others who are participating in this meeting. I think the question you've raised is very important because we don't always agree when it comes to diagnosing the situation or the strategies that need to be implemented. We continue to discuss the involvement of various actors in society so that we can eliminate the discrimination against women and girls. We need to clarify where and based on which principles a contribution is going to be made and what guidelines are going to be followed. We have a number of examples in Latin America of governments and groups who do not honor the achievement of rights, human rights for women and girls. They don't fully understand the concept of the gender issue. Discrimination against women and girls has been felt throughout the globe. In addition to the existing inequalities, there are complex structures and relationships of power in public policy. I would point out the importance of the work of some governments, such as our own, that have adopted a policy which is to commit to the human rights of women and girls, and we've been very successful. For a number of decades, this sector of the population was undervalued, but ultimately the United Nations assisted us, in particular UN Women worked with us to overcome a number of gender discrepancies in our country. Women do domestic work, they are subject to domestic violence, and women face a number of other issues because of the particular vulnerabilities they face. And the pandemic has clearly reminded us that the urban and rural regions are not the same. People living in indigenous communities, people living at the poverty line are impacted differently. This has impacted the informal sector of society, in particular poverty, women living and girls living in poverty and in indigenous communities. We need to ensure a social network to assist these women who've been subject to violence. We need to ensure a safe environment for women in terms of their physical safety, their economic safety. And I think the time has come to do even more work and to call for greater commitment from our partners. The achievements of women, the progress that we've made in ensuring substantive equality should not face any setbacks. So we must be committed to working with parliamentarians. We have to work with governments in the private sector, with individuals, with experts in the academic world, with workers, so that women can be ensured the right to work. As a defender of human rights for women, I'm suggesting that in the human rights field, it will be no progress unless we have the input from all sectors. On the 8th of March and the 9th of March, young women marched and called for a greater involvement. We need to have youth involved in ensuring that we meet our commitments. And those who are working with us need to understand that everyone will win if women are involved. If women if women's rights are ensured, everyone will move forward. The very negative impact of this pandemic has proven to us that we won't be able to emerge from this pandemic unless we have community involvement and the involvement of everyone. We can't go it alone. We need everyone, men and women, to build a fair world. Everyone needs to do his or her part. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Senator. Your words are incredibly palpable, and certainly given the context within which we operate, we certainly agree with you that meaningful solidarity and intersectional approach to stakeholder building is absolutely important. I want to come back to you, Senator, about that. But before I do, I want to turn it over to Humberto. Humberto, the Senator mentioned the importance of engaging all stakeholders. Of course, we know that men are important stakeholders to be engaged. Could you speak a little bit to that in light of what the Senator has just mentioned?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Eddie, and esteemed colleagues, for the opportunity to be part of this important event. First, I want to say that I stand in solidarity with the global movements, women's movement, the diverse social justice movements around the world, including the Black Lives Matter movement here in North America, the Me Too movement, the right to land and justice to indigenous peoples everywhere, and to LGBTQI movements, and so much more. And, you know, it's obvious the work with men and boys wouldn't be possible without the tireless advocacy of these diverse movements over the decades and the years. So as a result, our work must be accountable and intersectional, as gender inequality and gender-based violence disproportionately impacts vulnerable individuals, groups, and communities, as we've been hearing, in particular women and girls and young women. So the end goal of this work is the achievement of full equality, an opportunity for women and men, people of all genders and orientations, and for historically marginalized groups and communities. So promoting gender equality must also mean eliminating racism, colonialism, homophobia, transphobia, and all systems of discrimination and oppression everywhere. Men, therefore, have a crucial and dutiful role to play at the individual and collective level, at home, in individual interactions, in the community, and in our schools, in the workplace, in our institutions and cultural organizations, and in government and society at all levels. So this work must be done through an intersectional, feminist, and human rights lens, and it must be done in full partnership with the diverse women's movement and diverse social justice movements around the globe. In terms of best practices, I draw your attention to two recent previous deliberations where these have been presented, Resolution 3510 and the OHCHR report. And these recommendations are equally relevant in the context of the current COVID-19 pandemic, and even more so now given the increased rates of gender-based violence in the home. So some of those best practices include engaging men and boys in eliminating harmful practices, helping to transform discriminatory gender norms and stereotypes, and promoting nonviolent, respectful, consensual, and equal gender relations. This is especially important for boys and young men, but also for girls and young women, through the revision of integration of these important topics in school curriculum, because this will allow us to raise the next generation of gender equitable young people. So we must work to promote equal share responsibilities and care work, promoting full respect for the sexual and reproductive health and rights of women, girls, men, and non-binary persons. And we must do this through a life cycle and intergenerational approach. We need to promote the engagement of men in positions of authority and power as advocates to establish legal and policy frameworks that promote gender equality and dismantle all types of discrimination. Men in authority and power must share their power in decision-making and must ensure that underrepresented groups, including women, have access to that power in decision-making, as we've been hearing from so many of our esteemed colleagues. And finally, we need to mobilize men and boys to promote healthy masculinities, gender equality, and the elimination of all forms of gender-based violence everywhere in our homes, communities, workplaces, institutions, and government. We must do so by investing in this work, by partnering with women's organizations and women's rights organizations, using a multi-sectoral approach. And we must ensure we use inclusive and anti-oppression approaches where everyone has an equal seat at the table. And very importantly, we must do this without diverting existing resources allocated to promoting women's rights, empowerment, and leadership. That way, we can ensure that we all have the duty and responsibility to achieve gender equality everywhere. Thank you very much again for this opportunity, and I look forward to our dialogue.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Humberto. Anthony, I turn to you. If you could perhaps build upon what Humberto was just saying about the promotion of healthy masculinities, break that down for us. What does that look like in a meaningful way on the ground when we work with boys, young men, and older men? Deconstruct that for us.
All right, thank you so much for having me, Eddie, and everyone for inviting me to be part of this. Healthy masculinities. Well, first of all, I think there's an element of diversity in terms of culturally. There are different things to take into perspective when we talk about masculinities and what form of unhealthy patriarchal masculinities are manifesting itself. There's hegemonic masculinity, of course, that has been researched and spoke about, but how do they manifest themselves culturally? And that's really the starting point. It really is, how have men, boys, women, and girls been inundated with this idea of what it means to be a man from that patriarchal perspective. And that transformative process of really leading men to understand women, men, women, girls, boys, everyone, all people, to understand how negative that is towards the individual themselves who is espousing that patriarchy and who's manifesting that patriarchy themselves. That's harmful for them, and that's harmful for everyone around them. How that leads to the lack of voices and perspectives that lead us to develop and lead us more towards peaceful and engaging dialogue as communities. And that really is a process of how do you first let them see the chinks in that perspective, and then really providing a very feminist informed model of what egalitarian relationships look like, and essentially deviating from an idea or a desire to adhere to masculinity or femininity, and really move more towards humanhood and what that means to be a good person, interacting with other people and listening to all, and really building the power with and the strength that we get from all speaking to one another. And I think most importantly in this process, as many of my colleagues have already alluded to, is the fact that the feminist movement has really put us in a position where we're now having this dialogue. And when we look for ways forward, it really has to be based on how do we politicize the issues of gender equality and discrimination against women and girls and all their diversities from that feminist agenda, and to really be in touch with feminist organizations and CSOs and NGOs that work with marginalized populations and speak for marginalized populations, and how can we do that. And I think they give us the vision of what that means to be a version of healthy masculinity or egalitarian masculinity. And it's always going to be a process, checking our privilege. I can only speak from my personal place that I'm not the finished product. I've been working in this field for many years. I have so many role models who are strong feminists, and I still work on myself, and I look forward to working on myself even more under their guidance and leadership. And I think that's part of it, recognizing that women are the leaders in this, and we can learn so much, and we have to continually do that and bring down that perspective of our male privilege that we already know the answers.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I've been told that we can extend this conversation by an extra 10 minutes. So before I turn over to our participants for questions from the chat, I just want to go back to Stefan. Stefan, you are a founding member of the Unstereotype Alliance. And of course, we are currently operating against the backdrop of so many interlocking injustices. What does representation mean in this context when we need to be speaking about intersectionality and the ways in which, as Anthony mentioned earlier, we're not talking about monolithic groups. We're speaking about masculinities, we're speaking about feminisms, we're speaking about various isms that are operating at the same time. Could you speak to the importance of representation in terms of providing a nuanced articulation of the moment that we're currently in?
Hello, Eddie. A pleasure to be on the panel. Hello to the fellow panelists. I find the conversation incredibly insightful. I learn a lot. This is not the type of arena and conferences I'm used to, but it's a pleasure to be contributing. So my perspective is actually a perspective from a practitioners and advertising practitioners and media practitioners perspective. And so I'd like to share that it may sound surprising for professionals like you. Until 3 years ago, there was no widespread recognition in our industry, the global advertising industry, that we had an issue with the way we represented gender and more generally diversity in advertising. And for me, the aha moment personally was when I was presented one of the largest research ever conducted in that field by the Gina Davis Institute, which measured the representation of gender in the best and most awarded advertising campaigns of the last 10 years. And they did that with artificial intelligence tools and were able to quantify the type of roles the different genders were assigned to. There were twice as many male voices as female voices. 1% of women had humor. 2% of women were in positions of power, etc. And it was a realization of how big the gap was between where we thought we were and what the reality was. That led then UN Women to reach out to us with this partnership proposal, which is basically the Unstereotype Alliance. It's basically, let's all come together on the basis of that assessment, which is very challenging for the ad industry, but let's embrace a positive agenda for change. And that agenda for change has been gaining traction over the last 3 years. Very much focused in the first stage on gender, with clear metrics and reporting mechanisms in order to track progress made by those companies which have signed up to the partnership. It doesn't yet have the scale in order to be changing visibly, in my view, the way gender is portrayed in advertising globally, because it requires additionally local coalitions which are going to be mobilizing local brand owners too. But at least we have a global framework which for global brands is moving the needle. I know we can see that, and data is demonstrating it. Now to your question, gender is only one piece of a much bigger agenda, which is the diversity agenda. And there are so many intersectionalities that just focusing on gender seems almost disconnected with today's complexities and realities. And that's what we're embracing now. And certainly the Black Lives Matter movement is playing a very important role again in putting to the industry its societal responsibilities. I mean, I find it personally extremely exciting, the moment in which we are, having been in the industry for now over 25 years and realizing how much of a social responsibility there is from an advertising industry perspective. It cannot be only about achieving good outcomes for the business you're representing. There is increasingly an awareness that there is a bigger responsibility, which is a societal responsibility. And the interesting thing in today's day and age is that people, society, and consumers vote with their feet and with their wallet. And so not only is this a societal obligation, but there is actually also a built-in economic incentive for brands to be embracing those new challenges. That's what makes me particularly excited in a way, because I think that when societal aspirations converge with economic rationale, there's an opportunity to be driving and accelerating change. And I think that today exists both for the gender debate, but more broadly for the diversity debate. And what we're working on right now is how can we actually broaden the framework, which is very much focused on gender equality, in order to include the diversity dimension into our framework. But I remain committed that from an industry perspective, having a framework holding us to account, so that beyond the sort of nice statements, we're held to account in terms of data, and we need to be publishing those data, is a very important way to get traction. One of the big next steps we need to be envisaging, and we've started now already, is to move to the local level. Because in the end, there is no global consumer, there's no global citizen. There are local realities and there's a global agenda. But in order to translate those agendas in a meaningful, relevant, culturally relevant manner, you need local owners which drive that agenda. We've started it now in Turkey, United Arab Emirates, in Brazil, in South Africa, and Japan. And in each of those countries, you realize how important it is to be presenting those challenges in a manner that is culturally relevant so that you get traction locally. And so our next big challenge is, one, broaden the agenda in order to include properly diversity, and two, multiply those local actions in order to be relevant locally, because that is ultimately where the difference will be made.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Before I turn over to my colleague Jessica to help us field questions, I want to turn to you, Senator Marta. Stefan said something really important. He said people today are voting with their feet and with their wallets. In other words, what I'm hearing is that there's a general sense that people are fed up with injustice, people are fed up with inequality, and people want to feel meaningful outcomes in their lives. Could you talk to us a little bit about the importance of the political process? You are somebody that leads the Gender Commission in the upper house in Mexico. Talk to us about how we bridge the gap between outputs, which is the policy, and outcomes, which is the way that people experience their lives in real time.
¿Sí me escucho ya?
Can you hear me now?
It's okay.
Yes.
Sí. Muy bien.
Very well. Let me mention a very important point. It may sound as if I'm immodest, but I'm speaking from one of the most one of the parliaments in the world with the greatest level of parity. We have 48.6% of women in both chambers, and there have been constitutional reforms on gender parity. That was done last year so that we will have parity in all three levels of government, the federal, the state, municipal level, and also in the three branches of government. We're only the second country in the world that has achieved parity across the board. I'm very proud of that, because that's why women need to be in decision-making posts, so that we can change the lives of women. The presence of women, the awareness of women, doesn't always mean that we're going to have gender awareness. So we need to transform this power that we now have. We need to make it power that changes the lives of every woman, every girl, child, politically, economically, culturally. And I think that needs to be said because that's why we have women legislators, in particular women who have been fighting to have access to a fair distribution of power. We need to be there representing the feminist agenda and move that agenda forward, not the agendas of the past which violated women's rights, which led to domestic violence. On the contrary, we need to continue to move forward and ensure greater progress in the rights of women. And I think it needs to be said throughout the world, in our countries, we as feminists, defenders of women's rights, we need to continue to refer to the lack of access women have to decision-making posts. We need to point out inequalities. And I personally have a great deal of importance, I believe. The role I play is extremely important in the Parliament. Sometimes gender-based violence is seen as commonplace, as seen as okay in certain patriarchal societies. It's been normalized, but we need to make sure that we don't continue to normalize violence against women and girls. We're now looking at a very important agenda. We've ratified Convention 189 of the ILO to remunerate domestic work, and we're working on combating violence. It's actually not just one form of violence we're referring to, because one form of violence always leads to another form of violence against women. In the same country where we live, one violator will be punished in one way in one particular province, but punished in a different way in another province. And we need to make sure that that changes. We have included Social Security benefits for domestic workers. We've had a number of changes in the legal rights of women to make sure that women can have the law on their side. And we also have a national care system in places so that women can enter the workforce. We need to have a sharing of household work. I think the pandemic has set every country on its head, because I think people are now seeing how much work we women do in the household. We take care of children, we take care of the house, we take care of those who are ill, we do our jobs. It's really quite frightening. So we can't just say, let's hope that things get back to quote-unquote normal, because getting back to normal for us is going back to a world of inequality, a world of oppression, a world of discrimination and poverty. If we've learned anything at all in this pandemic, it's that we must not go back to life as normal, life as usual for millions of women across the world. We need to make economic, political, and social changes, and we need to legislate based on this new situation which we are living in our countries and we are living throughout the world. I'm very pleased with the men who want to create partnerships with us. It's extremely important. Why do I say that? Because men spend much less time on non-remunerated work and caring for children. Men daily spend 4 hours less than women. If you want, I can give you statistics, time, how much time is spent, but we need to make sure that we have this collaboration, this sharing and fair distribution of work. We need to have legislation so that we can continue to work on providing childcare for women at the national level so that women can enter the workforce. We need to continue to work in this area and legislate from a gender perspective, recognize that there's been inequality in many decisions. And I'm very proud, as I say, to be in a government which has full parity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Senator. Really, really insightful. Jessica, questions from the floor. Yeah.
Sure. There are two questions that I think might be effective as a piggyback off of what the Senator just said, if we could combine them. One is from Lisa Kelly, and the other is from Valerie Clary Miranda, the Sigma Theta Tau UN liaison. And they're both asking a question around multilateralism and partnerships. So in summary, multilateralism that prioritizes feminist movements and women's rights organizations is key to making concrete, accountable, implementable, and transformative change, as are partnerships with NGOs. How can we reclaim these spaces to make this happen and start to forge these partnerships with private industry? And the suggestion was for Stefan to start us off with this question.
Wonderful. Before I turn to Stefan, I actually think I might want to start with Misan. Misan, specifically, you are about advancing feminism within the context of institutions. And of course, right now we are bearing witness to the decimation of multilateralism globally. Right now we're seeing that there's pushback against that. Could you speak a little bit to that, Misan, in terms of the work that you do and how you sort of combine the feminist agenda with conversations around jurisprudence and tackling institutions within the context of multilateralism? And then we'll turn over to Stefan and Humberto and everyone else after.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you, Eddie. I think we all know that the multilateralism is at the great threat or a risk or a disastrous situation. And I think it is not a coincidence, as the currently dominant global power is driven by actually multinational corporations. And I think multilateralism is a kind of uncomfortable topic within the multilateral system, because it has to address the historical responsibilities of the countries, and then the divide and power and resource inequalities between the North and the South, and to go further to that between men and women. And I think the multilateralism, I think I ended my comment with public-public partnership. And I think it also brings us back to the point that it's all about power. And we have been talking about that there have been progress in laws and policies to advance women's human rights, but there has not been maybe enough implementation or accountability, because to implement those laws and policies, there still has to be power that be held by women to design how that have to be implemented with adequate resources to really liberate women and tackle the systemic systems of oppressions. And I think one of the ideas of enabling multilateralism is to bring the power back to the collective people's movements and realize people's sovereignty. And the public-public partnership has to be interpreted in a wider way. And it's not a new notion because it has been something that has been advocated by the trade unions, especially public sector workers. And to have a public-public partnership being clear on the role of the states as a duty bearers and women and people as right holders. And in doing that exercise, it also brings us to the point of having north to south and south to south cooperation and partnership that is accountable to the people's voices. And to go deeper a bit, because we're talking about women's human rights and gender equality, unless those global agenda and ways of international cooperations is designed by women on the ground and to identify and shape the global agenda and the way to implement back in our own context, it's again having collective feminist power that's systematically identifying and investigating the system of oppressions. And by doing that, we have to work with other people's solidarity movements. And I think that's the key. And that's why it is a bit, maybe very uncomfortable to talk about really genuine multilateralism, because it's all about power again. And the dominant power not wanting to let the power go.
Absolutely. Power, 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 power. Jessica, remind me, that question was initially addressed to Stefan. Is that correct?
It was, but that was a brilliant way to transition into it. Yes, it was for Stefan as well.
Wonderful. I want Stefan to pick up on that. But before I do we have any other questions from the floor? No other questions? Okay, I'm assuming more questions are still coming. Stefan, if you will, building off of what Misan just mentioned and saying that, you know, multilateralism, it's an uncomfortable topic given the politics of the day. How do you see this conversation through the lens of the private sector as somebody that's involved in advertising and representation? What does this moment mean for the work that you do in terms of the representation around advancing gender?
So the question on multilateralism, as seen from a perspective of business, is actually perceived a bit differently. I think we're all witnessing the increasing vulnerabilities of the post-war multilateralism and institutions in an increasingly fragmented and polarized world, and people actually increasingly expect brands to step up where governments and multilateralism is letting them down, interestingly, from our perspective. And so we're seeing, for example, when you look at the research which Edelman is running at the beginning of every year, the Edelman Trust Barometer, it's interesting to see that year after year, the level of trust in governments and established institutions like church and media, etc., is decreasing, whereas the expectations they're expressing with respect to companies and NGOs are increasing. And that's possibly a compensation of what they see as an increasingly dysfunctional political world order, possibly. And so brands are increasingly confronted with demands from society which go way beyond what they experienced so far. In the past, it was about offering better products and services and offering them to people so that they would be satisfied and repurchase. Increasingly, those brands are now confronted with questions which go far beyond their usual remit, and they touch upon very critical aspects of living together, of society, of addressing common global challenges, whether that's climate change, racial injustice, social injustice, Black Lives Matter, etc. And as brands seek to find response to that, because that is an increasingly pressing demand, they realize that they don't have the legitimacy per se, as such, to devise policies and approaches on issues which touch upon the very sacred in humankind and society, and so they don't have the level of trust and legitimacy to do that, and therefore they need partnerships with those which are entitled to have a view and a strategy on this. And this is why partnerships, public-private partnerships, are so essential for brands to step up to their new responsibilities. This is why what I think was a very courageous movement by the executive director of UN Women, when she reached out to us and said, let's create the Unstereotype Alliance. This is why it was so important for us, because I don't think we would be anywhere near in terms of mobilization in our industry, in terms of confronting what our responsibilities are, if we hadn't had the opportunity to do so with what is probably the most legitimate actor in that field when it comes to women's rights. And I think we will have a very similar requirement when it comes to address the bigger issue of diversity. We've had initial conversations with the Anti-Defamation League and a number of other civil rights organizations, and you realize that these are new dialogues which we haven't had in the past, and those institutions will have to guide us, because we will not be able to set that agenda. We will need to understand what the agenda is and see to which extent we can contribute to that, and again in a manner which I think always needs us to be very conscious of where our legitimacy is, where it starts and where it ends. We're business. I'm not naive. Not all the solutions to our societal ills will be driven by businesses. However, if we are smart, if we're able to identify those intersections, where there's a business interest and there's societal aspirations, I'm absolutely convinced that in today's day and age we can move mountains. And this is why I think these private-public partnerships are going to be so important going forward. And I shouldn't be calling them private-public. I should be calling them public-private partnerships in that order.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. You've hit the nail on the head. Jessica, let's get the last batch of questions before we get closing remarks from our panelists.
Okay, great. Eddie, which would you like? We have a batch around involving men and boys, specifically positioning them in allyship and advocacy, and also a batch of questions around data gaps and how to effectively monitor processes put into place. Where do you think is the best place to end?
I'd like to hear from Humberto and Anthony. So perhaps a question around engaging men and boys effectively, and then we'll get a final round of closing remarks from our panelists.
Great. So there are two questions. One is from the Friends of the Global Fight, specifically from Lannis Williams, and one is from Nyambura Catherine. So combining the questions, they read, how are you all engaging men and boys in preventing violence against women during the pandemic, and recognizing that fascism, pushback against women and girls' rights, and overall anti-rights and anti-choice rhetoric is rooted in patriarchy? How are men and boys movements positioning their advocacy and allyship beyond just involving men?
Fantastic. Humberto, I'll turn over to you, and then Anthony, please jump in after.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for that question, and it's a good one. So we do that in many ways, and first I think we focus a lot of our work on young people, and in particular young boys. And I think in order for us to achieve the next generation of gender equitable young people, boys, girls, young people of all genders, we need to present them with really great models, holistic models of equality and equity. And that doesn't mean just individuals who are role models, but we need to present them with systems, with environments, with communities, with institutions, so that they can see it all around them, through media, through their interactions with one another, through their engagements with their educators and their families at home, and by watching the people that they look up to. So that needs to be done, and that needs to be done now. It needed to be done a long time ago. This is about translating policy into action and reflecting that in our approaches on the front lines. So when it comes to engaging boys, young men, and men at this point, at this interjection, it's about giving them the tools, the information, the know-how, the self-awareness, the empathy, the compassion, to be able to be strong allies, to be able to stand in solidarity with those who are most affected by the pandemic, and to make sure that they're part of the solution rather than part of the problem, right? And to encourage men in particular to look for help when they're having difficulties at home or in the community or in the workplace, because that stands in the way of progress as well. And that's one of the reasons why we're seeing high rates of violence in our homes, is because men are not dealing with their stresses in very healthy kind of ways, and they resort to the old patriarchal, dominant, controlling ways of addressing conflict. And we see that in the home, we see that everywhere, and it's time that we change that. So we need more diverse representation everywhere, so young people can grow up believing that they can occupy those positions of power and decision making. We call on all policymakers to make sure that they're not just putting in place policies that are outward, but also look inwards in terms of changing their own institutions, and not just in terms of policymakers, but everyone, everywhere, including the private sector, boards of directors, CEOs. They need much greater representation. They need to look at who's missing at the table, because that's going to be part of the solution. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Humberto. Anthony, please feel free to jump in there.
Sure. Thank you so much for a wonderful question. And it's Humberto said so much. I would just maybe add a few points when we're talking about the pandemic. I think it's also very important, while engaging men, in order to challenge privilege, to bring the attention back on what is the situation for women and girls and people of different diversities and those most marginalized in our situations and in our cultures. Migrant domestic workers in Lebanon have been hit so hard by not only the pandemic. In Lebanon, currently, we're facing the worst financial crisis we've had in 3-4 decades. Our currency is devaluing. Political instability from revolutions that started in October before the pandemic. And so not only the voices of women and girls sometimes get lost, but issues that pertain to women and girls and violence against women and GBV and marginalized individuals, especially people from LGBTQI plus populations in a very conservative place like the Middle East. All of those do not get the limelight or the attention anymore. And so I think while engaging men, it's important to make that part of the conversation, and that can be challenging and there can be resistance, but that's part of the process. I love the comment about fascism, because I believe if we really want to challenge patriarchy, we have to challenge militarism and fascism and capitalism and all of the things that have been the perfect situation or environment for patriarchy to thrive. And just one, connecting, engaging men and boys and multilateralism and all the things we talk about is, if we want a system change from patriarchy to something that is more feminist and power with and horizontal, I think it's very important to not be dissuaded or enticed by a rejuvenation or a renovation of patriarchy. I think it's not enough to just say the words and maybe do a few things differently or change the outward appearance of patriarchy, but really to challenge, as Misu and other people said so well, the power and the decision making, and give that back to the local, which was essentially how the question started. And how do we empower the local organizations to lead that process?
Right. Fantastic. Thank you so much. So we've got only a few minutes left. And so I want to go around and ask each of you, we are marking 10 years left until we need to achieve the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. I want to hear from each of you what your vision is for gender equality within the decade of action for delivery on the global goals. So in one sentence, if you could give me your vision, Now that I have you, Anthony and Humberto, let's start with the two of you. And then after that, we'll go to Misan, Stefan, and then we'll close with the senator. Anthony.
Wow, so you're not asking for very much, just one sentence to talk about gender equality in the deck. Again, coming from a place that, in a region that knows conflict and war and death and guns and violence and not much else, it would be the complete opposite of that. It would be men, women, people of all diversities, people of all sexual and gender identities, equally sitting and peacefully resolving issues for the country, rather than reverting back to power over violent methods of doing so.
Beautiful. Humberto?
Yeah, significant decrease or elimination altogether of gender-based violence, increased our equal representation in our decision-making bodies and in boards, in CEOs, and equal opportunities for young people of all genders in our schools, in our communities, and equality in the home, amongst so many others.
Thank you so much. Misan?
Well, maybe in 5 sentences, if that is okay. We need
Oh, Misan? Did we lose Misan?
Yes, I'm back. Maybe
oh, you're back.
The 5
Thank you.
idea wasn't welcomed. So, yeah, I think we really have to break the system of oppressions, and only through feminist and solidarity power we can achieve it. And to end the system of oppressions, everyone has a role to play, but nobody needs the political or economic incentives to play that role. And this is really a time to put the voices and experience and solutions of women and their movements at the center, to chart out a new world that is not for domination, but for human rights, equality, justice, and peace for everyone. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Stefan?
I would dream of a world in 10 years' time that truly offers equal opportunity. Wherever you're born, whatever the color of your skin, whatever your religious origins, whatever your gender, and as an outcome, a society that is truly diverse. And what we've seen from societies that are truly diverse, whether it's today or in history, is they're so much more enriching. They're so much more tolerant. They're so much more. They offer so much more to society and to individuals. That's what I'm dreaming of for my children.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Senator, what is your vision for gender equality in the Decade of Action?
Bueno, pues,
in one sentence, no woman, no girl should be left behind. No woman, no girl left out. In other words, never again a world without women and girls. Without us, there's no democracy, there's no development, there's no peace.
Fantastic. I could not have said it better. Thank you, Senator. Thank you to all of my panelists, and thank you for bearing with me with the technology. I'm so glad that we had this conversation. It was incredibly dynamic and incredibly enriching. And indeed, we are in the business of making gender equality everybody's business. Thank you so much for this incredible conversation. And I now hand over to the rest of the program. Thank you so much.